I found the tent 3 days into what should have been a routine backcountry patrol. My name is irrelevant now. What matters is that I was a ranger. 23 years working the Blackbird Wilderness area in the heart of West Virginia's most remote peaks. I knew every ridge, every hollow, every creek that carved through the ancient mountains. Or I thought I did. What I discovered in that wind-scoured valley taught me that some places don't want to be known. It was late October, that dangerous season when the mountains turn cruel. The leaves had gone from gold to rust to something closer to dried blood. We were on high alert because 3 hikers had gone missing in the past 2 weeks. Unusual for a ranger station that typically saw maybe 1 lost person every 3 years. The county sheriff had called it in as a possible abduction, which made me laugh darkly. The mountains don't abduct people. They just take them. I was doing a solo sweep of the Northern Territories, checking for signs of the missing parties. My supervisor, a bureaucratic desk writer named Matthew from the central office, had reluctantly approved it. He wanted everything documented, filed, and by the book. I wanted to find people. The camp appeared around dusk on the 3rd day, nestled in a valley that shouldn't have been there. I'm not being metaphorical. I'd hiked this region countless times, and I knew the terrain with the kind of intimacy that comes from decades of work. There was no valley in that location. The USGS maps showed rocky outcroppings and a series of small ridges, but as I crested what I thought was a ridgeline, the ground fell away into a small depression surrounded by towering hemlock and white pine, and in the center of that impossible valley sat a camp. The tent was a military-grade canvas, weathered and stained, the kind you could actually live in during winter. A fire pit had been dug in front, rimmed with stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, not random campfire rocks, but an intentional circle with gaps at the cardinal directions. Around the pit sat supplies, canned goods, a water jug, what looked like hunting equipment stacked against a large stone. What struck me immediately was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of a remote wilderness, but something heavy and wrong. The wind that had been at my back all day seemed to die as I descended into that valley. The birds, ravens and crows that normally chattered in the October dusk, were gone. Even the usual forest sounds, those infinite small rustles of creatures moving through undergrowth, had ceased. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain. No answer. I approached carefully, hand moving toward the radio on my belt. In my 23 years, I'd never felt genuine fear in these mountains. Respect, yes. Wariness, always, but not fear. Fear was for people who didn't belong in wild places, and I belonged here more than I belonged anywhere else. The fear I felt walking toward that camp was of a different order entirely. The supplies were recent, that was immediately clear. The canned goods weren't dusty. A coffee pot sat on a rock beside the fire pit, still damp. But there was something wrong about the arrangement, something off about the camp's geometry. The tent faced north. Who camps facing north? And that circle of stones. As I looked at it more carefully in the dying light, I realized it wasn't random at all. It was deliberate, functional, the gaps positioned as if meant to channel something in or out. I noticed the smell then. It cut through the autumn air like a blade. A thick, sweet stench of decay mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something bestial and wrong. "This is Ranger Harrison," I called out, using my authority like a shield. "Show yourself. This area is restricted." More silence. That's when I saw the marks on the trees. They started about 10 feet from the camp perimeter and spiraled outward in a rough circle. I traced the pattern slowly, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The marks were on the bark of the hemlock trees, deep gouges as if something had raked its claws down the wood, over and over. Some marks were old, the wood inside oxidized to a dark brown. Others were fresh, showing the pale, wet wood beneath. They formed a boundary. I pulled out my flashlight as the last light drained from the sky, and that's when I saw him. The body was suspended between 2 trees about 40 yards from the camp, caught in a tangle of branches about 8 feet up. At first I couldn't process what I was seeing. The shape was humanoid, that much was clear. But the way it hung, the position of the limbs, the angles that seemed to bend in ways human joints shouldn't bend, my mind kept rejecting the image. I forced myself to look closer. The body was severely decomposed. Might have been hanging there for a week, maybe longer. But it wasn't the decay that made me take an involuntary step backward. It was the way it had been positioned. The arms were drawn up at impossible angles, elbows bent backward. The legs were twisted, and around the neck, around where the head should be, there was nothing but a stump, ragged with torn tissue. The head was gone. My radio hand moved before conscious thought could catch up. I keyed the mic, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Base, this is Harrison. I've found a body. Location is approximately..." I pulled up my GPS unit with shaking hands. The numbers that appeared on the screen didn't match any location that should exist in this sector. "I've got coordinates. I'm going to need immediate backup and medical personnel." The response from dispatch was static. Dead air. I tried again, getting only that hollow emptiness that means something is very wrong with the signal. That's when I heard the sound. It came from the forest beyond the camp. A long, low sound that wasn't quite a moan and wasn't quite a howl. It held no animal quality I could recognize. It was too complex, too structured, almost like a voice attempting speech but using a throat-shaped wrong for human language. The sound moved through the trees like something massive pushing through brush, coming closer. I had my pistol out without remembering drawing it. Not department standard for ranger work, but I'd always kept it close in the backcountry. Standard precautions. The sound came again, and this time I caught movement in the darkness between the trees. A shape, larger than any bear, moving with a terrible fluid grace. I caught only impressions, tall, impossibly tall, moving on what might have been two legs but with wrong angles. The silhouette was wrong, the proportions monstrous. I ran. I bolted back toward the ridge, abandoning any pretense of protocol or investigation. Something in my hindbrain, the old mammalian part that predates language and reason, was screaming at me that whatever was in that forest was a predator and I was prey. I made it to the top of the ridge as the last light died. Behind me, that sound, part voice, part animal, part something else entirely, echoed through the valley. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station 2 hours later. They didn't believe me, not at first. Matthew came down from the central office with a skeptical expression and 2 state police investigators named Hudson and Cooper. They interviewed me in the station break room with their notebooks out, the tone of their questions shifting gradually from genuine concern to barely concealed suspicion. "The exact location," Hudson said, tapping his pen against his pad. "You can pinpoint it exactly?" I pulled up my GPS unit. The coordinates I'd recorded in that valley glowed on the small screen, clear, precise, documented. "That location doesn't exist," Cooper said flatly. "I was there. I documented it." Hudson leaned back in his chair. "The coordinates place you 3 miles off the known trail system, in an area that's supposed to be solid ridge. No valley. We've been through these mountains with our own equipment and..." "The body," I said, cutting him off. "There's a body in those coordinates. A human body in an advanced state of decomposition suspended in trees about 40 yards northwest of the central point. That should be verifiable regardless of whether you believe my other observations." Cooper exchanged a look with Hudson, the kind of look that made clear what they thought. The ranger had been out alone too long, had stressed himself out, was seeing things. "We'll check it out," Hudson said in the tone people use with the unwell. "But I have to be honest with you, Mr. Harrison. Based on our review of the terrain maps and our own experience in these mountains, the location you've documented doesn't correspond to any accessible valley. The ridge system in that area is tight and impassable. We'd need essentially climbing equipment to get to the coordinates you've provided." "Then bring climbing equipment," I said. "But you'll find that body." They didn't find it. And when I insisted on taking them back to the location, the valley was gone. I realize how that reads. I understand what it means when a ranger claims a valley has vanished from the mountains. It means end of career, it means psychiatric evaluation, it means being the cautionary tale they tell at ranger seminars. But I stood on that ridge with Hudson and Cooper, and I showed them the GPS coordinates that should have put them in that impossible depression. Instead, we were standing on solid mountain ridge, surrounded by stunted growth and exposed rock. The hemlock trees with their claw marks didn't exist. The stone circle with its directional gaps was gone. The body was gone. "Maybe we came from a different approach," Cooper suggested carefully. "Terrain can be deceptive." "I know this area," I said flatly. "I've patrolled these mountains for 23 years. I know how to navigate. I know how to use a GPS unit. I was there. Hudson placed a hand on my shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt like restraint. We believe that you believe that, he said carefully. But there's a rational explanation. You were out here alone, stressed about the missing persons. Maybe you saw something in the distance, an animal, a natural formation, and your mind filled in details that weren't there. Happens to experienced outdoorsmen sometimes. Doesn't mean anything's wrong with you. It was exactly what I had expected them to say, and it was what made it impossible to convince them that something was genuinely, desperately wrong. Over the next week, I reviewed everything. I checked my GPS unit. It was functioning normally. I consulted the maps for my memory of the terrain. I even attempted to access the valley again from multiple angles, different entry points, different times of day. The valley never appeared again, but the missing hikers continued to vanish. After my failed attempt to locate the impossible camp, the disappearances actually increased. Where we'd been losing one person every few weeks, we suddenly had 2 disappeared in a single day. A family of 4. Parents named Julian and Victoria, with 2 teenage children, went hiking in a marked trail area and never emerged from the other side. Search and rescue was called in. Proper teams with dogs and helicopters. They found the family's camp, found their equipment, found the trail of their approach, but they found no sign of the family itself. The local news had begun covering it. Mystery in the Mountains was the headline they ran with. Theories proliferated. Serial killer. Cult activity, some kind of environmental hazard, methane vents from old mining operations maybe. The state police presence in the area tripled. Nobody mentioned the strange details. Nobody talked about how the searches always came up empty, how experienced trackers kept getting turned around in places they should have known by heart, how the missing person showed no logical trail of exit. I started keeping detailed notes, trying to document the pattern. There was nothing random about it. The disappearances clustered geographically, always in the remote areas, always in valleys and hollows that seemed somehow off, and there was an increase in animal encounters in those same areas. Hikers reported seeing bears with wrong proportions, hearing vocalizations that didn't match any known wildlife, finding deep claw marks on trees and patterns that seemed intentional. On the 10th day after my discovery of that impossible camp, I found a letter on my bunk at the ranger station. There was no envelope, no postmark, just a sheet of weathered paper with writing on it. Handwriting that looked old, as if it had been written decades ago but only just delivered. The mountains remember, it read. What was driven deep has grown hungry. The feeding has begun. You saw the boundary, Ranger. You saw the marked trees. You have 3 days before the circle moves again. The letter was signed with a symbol, a crude drawing that might have been a deer skull, or might have been something else entirely. I should have turned it in, should have reported it as a threat. Instead, I kept it. I studied it. I tried to reason through what it meant, and I began to prepare. The dreams started that night. They weren't normal nightmares. Fragmented, symbolic, the kind you forget upon waking. These dreams were vivid and persistent. In them, I moved through the Appalachian wilderness at night, following a path only I could see. I walked towards something vast and terrible, something that waited in the deepest hollows of the mountains. The dreams had a scent, that same sweet, rotten decay I'd encountered at the impossible camp. And they had a voice, that same impossible sound, part howl and part speech, calling me deeper into the darkness. I woke from each dream drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the details clinging to me with unusual clarity. On the 2nd day after finding the letter, I encountered Elias. He was one of the missing hikers who should have been dead. I found him on one of my regular patrols, standing at the edge of a known trail about 5 miles from the ranger station. He looked exactly as he had in the missing persons photo we'd been circulating. Same clothes, same backpack, same everything. But something was profoundly wrong with his appearance. His skin had taken on a waxy quality, almost translucent. His eyes were too bright, reflecting light like an animal's. And he was standing very, very still. Elias Brennan, I said carefully, remembering the name from the report. You've been missing for 9 days. He turned to look at me slowly, his neck moving in an unsettling way. Too flexible, bending at angles that made my stomach clench. Not missing, he said. His voice sounded layered, as if multiple people were speaking the same words at slightly different pitches. Found. Finally found where we belong. Where's the rest of your hiking party? In the mountains, Elias said. He smiled, and there was too much teeth in the expression. In the deep places, in the hungry places, where the old god feeds. I reached for my radio, trying to maintain professional composure, trying to get back up. But Elias moved, faster than a human should move, with a fluid grace that had no joints, and his hand was on my wrist. His skin was cold, so cold it burned. I jerked away, and he let me go with that too many teeth smile still in place. You've seen the markers, he said. You'll understand soon. The circle moves faster now. The hunger is greater. Some of us are chosen to guide it. Some of us, he tilted his head at an impossible angle. Some of us are called to feed it. He walked past me, back into the forest, moving with that wrong fluid motion. I called after him, but he didn't respond. When I turned to follow, he was gone. I reported the encounter to Matthew and the state police. Matthew suggested I take a leave of absence, voluntary, no judgment on my record. He said the stress was clearly getting to me. The state police were more concerned about the implications of Elias returning to the area but showed little urgency in following up. That night I reviewed every piece of Appalachian folklore I could find. The old legends, the stories that had been passed down through generations of mountain people. Most of it was folksy dismissal. Tales told to keep children away from dangerous areas, nothing more. But there were older references. In some of the historical documents from the earliest settlers, there were accounts of something that lived in the mountains. Something that followed the autumn season, moving from hollow to hollow. Something that required feeding. The accounts described it as a creature of hunger, ancient and patient, that had been there before the first humans arrived in the region. The settlers had called it by different names: the hollow mouth, the thin thing, the hunger that walks, but they all described the same fundamental truth. It was a predator that had learned to be patient, that had learned to wait for the seasons when humans penetrated deepest into the wilderness, when they were isolated and vulnerable. The old texts mention the markers too. Trees marked in circular patterns around areas where the creature hunted. Marks made by the creature itself, territorial warnings and hunting boundaries. And they mention the chosen ones, people who had been touched by the creature, who had been marked for transformation. They were described as guides, as bait, as feeders. They weren't fully human anymore, but they weren't the creature either. They existed in a space between, serving something vast and ancient. Reading those accounts, I understood what Elias had become. I also understood that I had been marked. On the third night after encountering Elias, I noticed the marks on the trees surrounding the ranger station. Deep gouges in the bark of the old pines, arranged in that circular pattern I'd seen in the Impossible Valley. The boundary had been drawn around the station. I prepared that evening with methodical precision. I packed supplies, water, high-calorie food, a charged GPS unit, maps, my service pistol, a good blade. I left careful notes documenting everything I'd found: the Impossible Valley, the body, the transformed hiker, the letter, the dreams. I left them where they'd be found if I didn't return, and I waited for nightfall. When the dreams came that night, I didn't resist them. Instead of fighting to stay awake, I let myself sink into them. Let the strange visions guide me deeper into the landscape of sleep. In the dream, I rose from my bunk and walked out into the darkness. The mountains were alive with sound, that terrible, impossible voice calling from the depths, mixed with other voices, human voices distorted into something no human throat should produce. I walked toward those voices, and even knowing it was a dream, even knowing something was fundamentally wrong, I walked toward them willingly, because I needed to understand, because part of me, some ancient part that predates reason and civilization, recognized something familiar in that call. The creature in the mountains wasn't an invader, it was native. This was its land, and we, all of us human intruders, were just another seasonal food source, no different from the deer that the wilderness supported each year. The only difference was that we could be marked, transformed, made into something that could serve a larger hunger. And I was beginning to understand that there might be worse things than being consumed. There might be worse things than being incorporated into something vast and eternal and profoundly, perfectly adapted to this ancient land. I woke to find my window wide open and wet leaves scattered across my bunk. The next entry in my memory is fragmented and dreamlike. I remember standing in the ranger station parking lot, GPS unit in hand, watching the device cycle through coordinates that moved like a living thing. The valley, the impossible valley that should have never existed, was appearing on the device's screen again, but the location was different. It was closer now, much closer. I got in my truck without conscious decision and drove toward those coordinates. The roads became smaller as I drove, turning from paved highways to county routes to unmarked forest roads. The truck bounced over ruts and washouts, and I drove in a state that existed between waking and dreaming, guided by something that wasn't quite my own will. When the road finally terminated, I got out and walked. The forest at that depth is different. The trees are larger, older, gnarled with centuries. The undergrowth is thick, rhododendron and mountain laurel so dense you have to push through. The air is heavier, less like air and more like something ancient taking breath around you. The valley appeared as I crested a ridge that shouldn't have been there, just as it had appeared before. But this time it was fuller, more solid. The impossible made real and persistent. The camp had expanded. Multiple tents now, arranged in patterns that seemed geometric, mathematical in their precision. More supplies were stacked, enough for an extended occupation, and around it all, the circular boundary of marked trees had grown, expanding like a living thing. There were people in the valley, or people-shaped things. Some were in advanced states of transformation, bodies that had begun to wear the shape wrong, as if something was testing different forms. Some looked almost human, but with eyes too bright and movements too smooth. And some had clearly been there longer than others, their forms degraded to something barely recognizable. In the center of the camp, standing taller than the tents, I saw the source of the mark. It took my mind a long time to process what I was looking at. The creature was roughly bipedal, but bipedal doesn't capture its form. It was tall, easily 12 feet, maybe taller, and impossibly thin. Its body seemed to shift and flow as I watched, as if it didn't have a fixed form but existed in multiple configurations simultaneously. Its head was the worst part, elongated, with a mouth that opened far too wide and articulated in ways human jaws shouldn't. The teeth inside were countless, each one too long, arranged in spirals rather than neat rows. The creature turned to look at me, and that act of attention was like standing in front of an open furnace. It saw me, and in being seen by it, I felt something crack open inside my chest. "You came," a voice said. I looked to my right. Joshua was standing there. Joshua Brennan, another of the missing hikers. I remembered his photo from the flyers. He had a wife and 2 children in Charleston. He'd been missing for 17 days. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Always," Joshua said. "Since I was born, really. I just didn't know the way before. But the call found me. The mountains called, and I came home." Joshua's skin held that same waxy translucency as Elias's. His eyes reflected light, but unlike Elias, Joshua seemed at peace, happy even. "It's not taking us," Joshua continued. "That's the misunderstanding. It's teaching us. We're becoming something more. We're becoming part of what this land is, part of what it's always been." Other figures moved through the valley. I recognized some of them from the missing persons reports. Mothers and fathers and children, all moving with that same wrong fluidity, all with that same terrible peace on their faces. The creature lowered its long, wrong head and looked at me directly. "Come," it said. And the voice wasn't external. It came from inside my skull, resonating through my bones. I found myself walking down into the valley without making the conscious decision to do so. My legs carried me forward, and I let them. "The transformation is not painful," Joshua said, walking beside me. "That's another misunderstanding. There's no suffering. There's only becoming. Only finally understanding what you always were, beneath the pretense of being human." As we walked deeper into the valley, I could feel something happening to my vision. Colors were becoming too bright, too clear. I could see heat radiations coming off the other transformed beings. I could see the breathing of the forest, the slow movement of nutrients through trees, the circulation of life through everything green. The creature reached out one long, articulated arm and touched my forehead with something that might have been a finger or might have been something else entirely. The sensation was cool and electric. And in that moment, everything became clear. I understood that the mountains were alive in a way human language struggles to describe. They weren't metaphorically alive. They were alive. The whole landscape was an organism, And the creature was its predator, yes, but also its immune system. Its predator, its agent of control. And I understood that we, humans, were not the apex of this landscape. We were intruders, seasonal visitors who sometimes stayed too long and required culling. The creature wasn't evil. It was necessary. And those of us who had been marked, who had been called to the mountains, we were being offered a choice I'd never known existed: remain human and temporary, or become something vast and eternal, part of the mountains forever. When the creature's hand fell away from my forehead, I felt different, changed. The world was sharper, and I could see the fine lattice of connections that linked every living thing in that valley. "What do you choose?" the creature asked. And now I could understand its voice perfectly. It spoke in the language of stone and root and hunger, and I could interpret every syllable. I opened my mouth to answer, and that's where my memory becomes unreliable. Because the truth is, I don't know what I chose. I don't remember the transformation, if that's what happened. I don't remember screaming or acceptance. My next clear memory is dawn, standing in the forest 3 miles from the ranger station, my clothes torn and my hands covered in something dark that might have been dirt. My body was human. My voice was human. My thoughts occurred in human language. But something had changed. Something fundamental and irreversible. I walked back to the ranger station and submitted my resignation, effective immediately. No explanation beyond a brief note that read, "My service in these mountains is concluded. Something is changing in the deep places. Something is waking. The mountains are taking what belongs to them." Matthew tried to convince me to stay. The state police wanted to interview me about the missing hikers. The local news was asking about my unusual departure. I ignored all of it and left the mountains. That was 4 months ago. I'm living in a city now, trying to maintain the pretense of normalcy. But every night, in dreams and in waking moments, I hear the call. The mountains are remembering me. The thing that marked me is patient. It can wait. And part of me, the part that was born in this world long before my human consciousness, part of me is answering that call. The seasons are shifting. Autumn is coming again. The missing persons reports from Appalachian regions are increasing, just as they did before. I've seen others like me in cities across the country. People whose eyes are too bright, whose movements are too smooth, who seem to be waiting for something. Guides, I think. Anchors, reminders. The creature in the mountains is spreading its hunger. The circle is expanding, and soon, when autumn comes again and the mountains call loudest, I will go back. I will choose what I should have chosen from the beginning. I will finally come home. I should have turned back when I heard the first scream. Not a human scream. I knew what those sounded like. I'd lived in the Appalachian Mountains my entire life, 43 years of it in a cabin 7 miles from the nearest town. No. This was something else, something that came from deep in the forest, a sound that seemed to originate from the throat of something too large, too hungry, too wrong to have a proper name. It lasted exactly 3 seconds before cutting off, like someone had slammed a door on reality itself. My name is Harrison. I'm a mountain man by trade and temperament, the kind of person people hire when they want something found in the wilderness, lost hikers, wandered off livestock, that sort of thing. I've never asked for much. A cabin, a rifle, the forest. The forest has always been enough, or at least it used to be. It was November 15th when everything changed. The date matters because I wrote it down in my journal that night, thinking it might be important someday. I had no idea how right I'd be. I was tracking a missing elk that had strayed from the protected valley lands where they were supposed to stay. The animal had gone deeper into the ridge. That's what we call the uninviting stretch of mountains that runs like a spine through this part of Appalachia. Most locals won't go out there past twilight. There are old stories. Every region has them, right? Tales passed down from grandmothers and drunken uncles about things that shouldn't exist. Things with hunger in their eyes and ice in their veins. I'd always dismissed them as folklore. The thing about fear is that it works differently at night in the mountains. During the day you can rationalize. You can see the branches and rocks and understand that the shadows are just shadows. But when darkness falls and the trees become absolute black walls around you, when your flashlight beam seems to get swallowed immediately by the dark rather than cutting through it, something ancient wakes up in your mind, something that remembers when humans weren't the apex predator. Something that knows there are places we shouldn't go and things we shouldn't find. I had my rifle, my hunting knife, and about 2 hours before the last light would completely leave the sky. The elk's tracks had gone cold about a mile into the ridge, but I could see disturbed brush, broken branches at an unusual height, and what looked like dried blood on a cluster of rocks. Something had happened here, something that involved violence. Then I heard the scream. It died as quickly as it began. But in that 3-second window, every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to run. The sound had come from deeper in the forest, maybe half a mile north. It didn't sound like an elk call. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard. It was almost human, the kind of thing that makes you question whether you actually heard it at all, or just imagined it. I stood there in the gathering darkness, my hand on the grip of my rifle, and made a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I went toward it. I can't explain why. Professional curiosity maybe. Stupidity probably. The need to know what had made that sound and why. Whatever it was, I followed the bearing northward through increasingly thick forest. The trees grew denser the deeper I went, their branches knitting together overhead until the last of the daylight seemed impossibly far away. The forest floor was a carpet of dead leaves and moss, everything dampened by the recent rain. I could move quietly this way, which I did, keeping my flashlight off and letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. My rifle was ready but not raised. I still told myself I was just investigating, that there was nothing actually wrong, that mountain wildlife could explain everything. Then I found the clearing. It was maybe 30 yards across, a circular patch where the trees had simply stopped growing. Except that's not quite right. The trees hadn't stopped. They'd been pushed back. Ancient oaks that had to be 300 years old were splintered and cracked, their massive trunks snapped like toothpicks and scattered around the perimeter of the clearing. The damage wasn't recent. Judging by the lichen growth and the way the wood had weathered, whatever had done this had done it years ago. But it had done it with such force, such absolute casual violence, that it suggested something almost too terrible to consider. In the center of the clearing was what remained of a campsite, a tent mostly shredded. Sleeping bags, sleeping in a way sleeping bags should never be used. Cooking equipment scattered like a child's toys after a tantrum. And blood. So much blood that the earth still looked dark with it, even in the failing light. I forced myself to breathe slowly, forced myself to look away from what the blood might have come from. This wasn't an animal kill site. Animals don't shred nylon and canvas. Animals don't scatter gear with what looked like deliberate malice. This looked like something playing with its prey. I was so focused on the clearing that I almost missed it when the forest itself went silent. You don't realize how much sound a forest makes until it all stops. The birds, the insects, the small animals rustling through the underbrush, everything vanished like someone had flipped a switch. The silence was absolute, suffocating. The kind of quiet that only comes right before something terrible happens. Then I smelled it. Rot and copper and something else. Something ancient and spoiled that made my stomach clench and my eyes water. It was the smell of a predator's lair, of a place where death had become so familiar it had worn grooves into the very air. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking now. Adrenaline flooding my system with the realization that I was no longer alone. The shadow moved between two trees at the far end of the clearing. I couldn't make out details. The darkness was too complete, but I could see the shape, too tall. The silhouette wrong in a way my brain couldn't quite process. It was bipedal, vaguely humanoid, but the proportions were subtly off. The limbs were too long, the shoulders too broad. As I watched, it tilted what might have been a head in my direction. I raised the rifle and aimed. The thing's laughter was worse than the scream had been. It wasn't a human laugh. It didn't come from a human throat. It was the sound of wind through a corpse, of ice cracking under unimaginable pressure, of every primal fear humanity had ever felt, all concentrated into a single horrible sound. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the mountains, filling the world, and then it was gone. I fired at where it had been, a reflex action that was stupid and brave and useless all at once. The shot echoed through the mountains, loud as thunder in the sudden silence. I chambered another round, my breath coming in gasps, and spun in a slow circle, rifle raised, trying to track movement I couldn't quite see. Nothing. The forest had become black and impenetrable. My eyes couldn't adjust anymore. There wasn't enough light. I was blind and exposed, and something that wore darkness like a skin was close enough to smell. I ran, not the way I'd come. I wasn't thinking clearly enough for that. I just ran through the forest, branches whipping at my face, my rifle held close to my chest, crashing through the underbrush without any attempt at stealth. I could hear it behind me, not pursuing, not exactly, following, moving through the forest the way I imagine a ghost would move, appearing in my peripheral vision, vanishing when I turned my head, always just at the edge of what I could perceive. The trees began to thin. I could see the stars now, just barely, and I realized I'd run toward the edge of the ridge. I could see the lights of town maybe 3 miles away down the mountainside, scattered like diamonds on black velvet. I didn't stop running until I reached the tree line. Even then, I kept going, half running, half falling down the mountain, my legs pumping, my breath burning in my lungs. I didn't look back. If I had looked back, I think my heart would have just stopped. Some part of me would have finally broken. It took me 40 minutes to reach my truck. 40 minutes of running down a mountainside in the dark, through terrain that should have broken my legs. But fear is an excellent motivator. Fear makes you move faster than you ever thought possible. I sat in my truck for an hour before I could start the engine. My hands were shaking too badly to grip the key. I kept seeing that silhouette, that wrongness of proportion, that impossible laughter. By the time I drove away from the trailhead and back toward town, I'd convinced myself that I'd imagined most of it. The stress of the search, the darkness, the way the mind can turn ordinary forest sounds into monsters. That's what I told myself, but I knew the truth. Somewhere on that mountain, in that clearing surrounded by snapped trees and dried blood, something was waiting. Something old and patient and hungry. Something that had been there longer than the mountains themselves. And it knew I was coming back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my cabin with every light on and my rifle across my lap, staring at nothing, replaying the sounds over and over in my mind. The scream, the laughter, that breathing in the dark that might have been imaginary but didn't feel imaginary. Around 4 in the morning, I made a decision. If what I'd encountered was real, and increasingly I was certain it was, then it had to have a history, local lore, stories, something. By dawn, I was at the county library. Our head librarian is a woman named Miranda, probably in her 70s now, who has lived her entire life in these mountains and remembers everything. I found her reorganizing old newspapers in the microfiche section. "Harrison," she said, not looking up. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Tell me about the old stories," I said. "The things they used to say lived in the ridge. Warnings about where you shouldn't go." Miranda stopped what she was doing. She looked at me for a long moment over her reading glasses. "That's an interesting question." "I heard something last night," I said carefully. "Something that didn't sound natural." She was quiet for a moment. Then she led me to the back archives, to shelves that held the oldest records. Journals, newspaper clippings, folklore transcripts from researchers decades ago. She pulled out a particular box without hesitation, as if she'd been expecting this request. "These are accounts," she said, "from people who've had experiences in the ridge, going back about 200 years. Most people dismiss them, but they're consistent, very consistent." What she showed me over the next 3 hours made my skin crawl. The accounts were fragmented, written by different people across different centuries, but they described the same thing with remarkable consistency. A creature of enormous size and strength, impossibly tall, with wrong proportions, an appetite that was never satisfied, a hunger that bordered on ritualistic, and most disturbing, descriptions of a sound it made, a hybrid between laughter and a scream that drove people into panic. One account from 1847 described it as a thing of terrible thinness, all angles and hunger, with a voice like the death of hope itself. Another from 1923 spoke of a great emaciated shape that moved with joints that bent in ways that flesh shouldn't bend. A third from 1956 simply said it wore a man's shape like a costume that didn't quite fit. But the older accounts, the ones that seemed to come from the earliest settlers, they called it by name. Wendigo. The word appears in scattered documents, sometimes in English, sometimes in what looked like attempts to transliterate something from older languages. The accounts suggested that the creature was old, older than the mountains themselves, or at least older than European settlement. Indigenous peoples had known about it, had feared it, and some of the oldest documents suggested they had names for it, rituals for keeping it away from populated areas. One handwritten note, dated 1804 and attributed to someone named Dr. a scholar named Heberman, described the creature's habits. It hunts when the hunger becomes unbearable, which happens in the cold months. It claims territory and defends it with terrible violence. The creature is not native in the biological sense. It is something else, something that exists on the margins between our understanding and the unknowable. The locals say it sustains itself on human flesh, but only when it grows desperate enough to risk proximity to civilization. More often it hunts the wild things, elk, bear, anything large enough to satisfy its appetite, if anything ever does. The most recent account was from 1987. A hiker had gone missing in the ridge. He was found 3 days later, wandering down the mountain in a state of shock, unable to speak coherently for weeks. When he finally recovered enough to give a statement, he described seeing the thin thing deep in the forest, moving on limbs that seemed too long, watching him with eyes that weren't placed right on the face. Or maybe there was no face. Just the feeling of being watched by something that wanted to understand human suffering. He was found dead in his home 6 months later. Officially, it was listed as cardiac arrest. Unofficially, the detective who investigated noted in the file that he'd found journals in which the man obsessed over the encounter, over what he'd seen. Page after page of descriptions that became increasingly incoherent and desperate. "Why are all these still here?" I asked Miranda. "Why isn't this public knowledge?" "Because," she said carefully, "in every generation, there's someone who comes forward with an encounter. And in every generation, people explain it away as animal attack, hallucination, mental breakdown. It's easier to dismiss than to accept. After a while, the stories become something between fact and folklore. Nobody knows what's real anymore." "But you believe it," I said. She didn't deny it. "My grandfather saw something in those mountains when he was young, something he never wanted to talk about. But he left instructions that his granddaughter was to watch the library archives, and if anyone came asking about the old stories, I was to tell them the truth. He said one day someone would come who actually understood what they'd seen, someone who could finish what previous generations had started." "Finish what?" I asked. Miranda looked at me intently. "That's something I think you're going to have to figure out for yourself, Harrison." 3 nights later, I made the decision that someone would probably call the worst decision of my life. I was going back to the ridge, but this time, I wasn't going to run. I spent those 3 days preparing. I gathered everything I could find about the Wendigo, historical accounts, folklore, any scrap of information that might give me insight into what I was dealing with. I learned that the creature operated on cycles, that it had territories, that it seemed to have an almost intelligent awareness of humans. I also learned something that made my blood run cold. Once a Wendigo had marked someone, had identified them as a threat or as prey, it would pursue that person with terrible patience. It would hunt them across mountains and through seasons if necessary. I had marked myself. In the old journals, there were accounts of people who'd survived encounters with the Wendigo and then spent their lives either fleeing it or hunting it. Those who fled were eventually found, driven mad by the pursuit. Those who hunted it, well, most of them died in the attempt. But a few, a very few, seemed to have found ways to coexist with the creature, to understand its patterns and predict its movements. I decided to be one of those few. I outfitted myself with supplies for a week in the wilderness. Hunting knife, rifle, ammunition, food, water, a tent, and, after careful consideration, a knife made from silver, based on the old folklore that suggested precious metals could affect the creature. I also took every account, every journal entry, every scrap of information I could carry, laminated in waterproof plastic. I left a message with Miranda that if I didn't return in 2 weeks, she should contact the authorities. Then I drove back to the ridge. This time I followed the mountain road to a different trailhead, approaching from the north. The plan was to move slowly, to study the creature's territory, to understand its patterns. If the accounts were accurate, I might be able to predict where it hunted, when it hunted, and perhaps most importantly, what it wanted. It took me 6 hours of climbing through dense forest before I found it. Not the creature, the cabin. It appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, a structure so hidden by overgrowth and decay that I almost missed it. It was old, maybe 100 years or more, constructed from logs that had weathered to the color of bone. The windows were covered in vines. The door hung open, and despite every instinct screaming at me not to, I went inside. The interior was a tomb of dust and darkness. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, illuminating motes of dust that hung in the air like tiny ghosts. There was furniture, a table, chairs, a bed frame in the corner, and on the walls, covering almost every inch of wood, were carvings. Not random carvings, deliberate, careful, obsessive carvings. Some were simple marks, tally lines that suggested someone had been keeping count. Others were more elaborate, crude drawings of something tall and impossibly thin, but most of them were words. I had to trace the carved lines carefully, making out letters that the dust had obscured. It watches me. I can feel it watching me. 3 months without leaving the cabin. If I open the door, it will know I am here. I understand now. It doesn't hunt because it is hungry. It hunts because it cannot help itself. The hunger is what it is. There is no satisfaction, only temporary fullness before the hunger returns. I have seen its face. God help me, I have seen its face. There is nothing behind the eyes, nothing at all. Just the hunger stretching back to a time before time. It has been circling the cabin for 6 days. I can hear it moving through the forest. It sounds like wind through a graveyard, like death learning to walk. The final carving was the most detailed, a drawing that took up most of one wall. It showed the creature standing on hind legs, arms raised, its body a map of angles and impossible joints, and above it carved so deeply that the knife must have pierced all the way through the soft wood. If you read this, you are cursed. It has seen you. It will never stop seeing you. Run, or prepare to spend your life in this cabin, counting the days until it breaks through the door. Below that, dated what looked like 1989, was a signature, Marcus Bright. If anyone finds this, tell my family that I tried. God help us all. I didn't realize I was shaking until I tried to leave the cabin. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip my rifle. The weight of the words, the desperate fear encoded in every carving, it was like the previous occupant's terror was a living thing in the cabin, infecting anyone who stood in that space. But there was something else too. Beneath the fear, I sensed something like understanding. Marcus Bright had lived in this cabin for months. He had made the transition from terror to observation, to a kind of horrible knowledge. He had learned something about the creature, and he had tried to leave messages for whoever came after him. I spent that night in the cabin. I know that sounds insane, but there was a logic to it. If the Wendigo was going to hunt me, if it was going to pursue me, then I might as well be ready for it. The cabin provided shelter, defensible space, and most importantly, it provided information. I spent hours reading through Marcus's carvings, trying to extract meaning from his descent into obsession. The creature, Marcus had noted, seemed to follow patterns. It hunted in cycles. It preferred certain prey. It was intelligent, perhaps more intelligent than humans, but in a way that was fundamentally alien to human understanding. And crucially, Marcus had discovered something that made him stop trying to escape and instead seemed to have made peace with his situation. I have learned its name. Not the word, but the concept, the thing it is. It is not a creature that exists outside time. It is hunger, given form. It is the knowledge that death is coming, made manifest. It walks the mountains because the mountains are the last wild place. And in wild places, the truth is harder to ignore. It is not evil. Evil requires intention. This thing is simply what it is, a force of nature that humans are not equipped to process. And knowing this, I can finally stop running. The last carving was different. It looked like Marcus had put down his knife and taken up something else, maybe a stick or bone, to write a final message in the dust of the cabin floor. It comes at midnight. I am ready. There was no indication of what happened after that. The cabin sat empty, the carvings standing as testimony to a man who had either died or found some way to make peace with the impossible. I thought about Marcus all through the night, sitting in his cabin, surrounded by the evidence of his descent into obsession. And when midnight came, When the forest outside began to move with something that was definitely not wind, I didn't run. Instead, I stepped outside and waited. It came through the trees like smoke, given terrible purpose. In the moonlight, weak and distant, filtered through the canopy, I could finally see it clearly. The creature was exactly as I'd glimpsed it that first night, but worse because now I could see all of it. The proportions were so wrong, so geometrically disturbing, that my mind kept trying to interpret it as something natural, something that could be explained by the way the light was hitting it. But I knew the truth. This was not a trick of shadow and moonlight. This was what it looked like. The body was impossibly thin, all rigid angles and elongated bones. The limbs were too long, the joints bent in ways that suggested an anatomy I couldn't begin to comprehend. But it was the head, if you could call it that, which was most disturbing. It seemed to articulate wrongly, connected to the neck at an angle that would have snapped a normal spine. And the face was almost human, almost right, like someone had tried to carve human features out of wood but gotten the proportions slightly off in a way that made looking at it feel fundamentally wrong. The eyes were the worst. They were too far apart, and they looked at me with an intelligence that was utterly inhuman, cold, curious, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with appetite and everything to do with the desire to understand suffering. "You came back," it said. The voice wasn't what I expected. It wasn't the hybrid scream laugh that had filled the forest before. It was almost conversational, dry, dusty, like wind moving through old bones. The creature was speaking to me in English, with an accent I couldn't quite place, as if the language was something it had learned by listening to people die. "I wanted to understand," I said. My voice was steady, which surprised me. The creature moved closer. I could smell the rot and copper again, but there was something else underneath. A smell like winter, like the inside of a cave that hadn't seen light for centuries. Understanding is not possible. Your mind is too small, too finite. You live in one moment, one body, one perspective. I am the sum of everything that hungers. I am hunger itself. There is nothing to understand except the inevitability of it. "You're lonely," I said suddenly. The creature stopped moving, its head tilted in that wrong, articulate way. "What? You're lonely. You exist outside of everything. Not fully animal, not human, not part of any ecosystem that would recognize you. You hunt because the hunger is what you are, but also because the hunting is the only way you get contact, recognition, proof that something else exists." For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl, the first natural sound I'd heard since the creature arrived. "There was a man," the Wendigo said finally. "He lived in the cabin you've discovered. For many months. He carved messages, trying to understand me the way you are trying to understand me now. In the end, he accepted what he was. Prey that had learned to look into the eyes of the predator without flinching." "What happened to him?" I asked. "He walked into the forest one night during a new moon. He never came back. Or perhaps he did. And he simply decided he no longer wanted to live as a human. I don't consume all of my food. Some of it walks away. Some of it changes, the way he must have changed." I realized then what Marcus's final message had meant. "It comes at midnight. I am ready." He hadn't meant he was ready to die. He meant he was ready to accept transformation. "I'm not ready for that," I told the creature, "but I want to make a bargain." The Wendigo's laughter was different now. Not the bone-scraping horror sound, but something almost like genuine amusement. "What could you possibly offer that I would want?" "Stories," I said. "Information, understanding of what humans are beyond the moment when they're dying. I can't give you what Marcus gave you. I'm too afraid still. But I can tell you what it means to be human, what it means to live with hope and meaning, and the 1,000 small connections that humans make with each other. And in exchange, you leave the people of these mountains alone." The Wendigo was silent for a very long time. "There is another cabin," it said finally, "deeper in the mountains, further than even Marcus ventured. Many generations ago, it belonged to a man who made a similar bargain. He lived there for 30 years. He would enter the forest when the hunger became too much, and I would follow. And then, he would tell me stories of his childhood, of love, of loss, of the texture of human experience. And for a time, the hunger was less acute. What happened to him? Eventually, even stories became insufficient. He walked deeper into the mountains and did not return. But I remember him. I remember all of them. And I keep the mountains clear of hunters, of intrusion, because keeping this wild place untouched is what he asked of me. The Wendigo took a step back. You may go to the cabin. You may attempt the bargain. But know this, Harrison. The hunger is eternal. It doesn't tire. It doesn't forget. And one day, it may consume even your stories. Then I'll find better stories to tell, I said. The creature tilted its head again, as if considering something beautiful and terrible all at once. Then it turned away, moving back into the forest with that unnatural smoke-like grace. Within seconds it had vanished among the trees, and I was alone in the darkness with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the terrible, wonderful knowledge that I had just made a deal with something that defied all natural law. I spent the rest of that night in the cabin, sitting in the darkness waiting for dawn. And when the sun finally rose over the Appalachian Mountains, burning away the mist that clung to the valleys, I packed my supplies and headed deeper into the wilderness, looking for the cabin the Wendigo had spoken of. My old life, my cabin, my search and rescue work, my carefully constructed normalcy, was behind me now. Ahead lay only the mountains, the hunger, and the strange obligation to feed something's understanding with stories of what it meant to be human. I don't know if I made the right choice, but I know it was my choice, made with open eyes and full knowledge of what I was accepting. And somewhere on the ridge, in the spaces between civilization and true wilderness, I'm still here, still telling stories to something that wears a man's shape like a costume that doesn't quite fit, trying to give meaning to something that shouldn't exist. The hunger never stops. But in the spaces between the hunger, there is something that might almost be called peace, and that, I've learned, is enough. The scream didn't come from anything human. I knew that immediately, though I've spent 12 years as a ranger in these Appalachian Mountains and heard sounds that should have prepared me for almost anything. But this wasn't a sound I could place into any catalog of wildlife calls. Not a mountain lion's wail, not a dying elk, not even the unholy shriek of a bobcat in territorial rage. This was something that made my nervous system reject its own conclusions. I was 3 miles deep into the Blackwater Gorge, alone, running a trail survey in the pre-dawn darkness when I heard it. My name is the narrator of this story, and what happened next defies every rational explanation I've spent the last 6 months trying to construct. The beam of my flashlight caught nothing but the twisted trees that border the trail, their limbs reaching like arthritic fingers into the fog that never seems to fully lift from this part of the mountains. I'd come out early specifically because the quieter hours usually meant better data collection, fewer hikers, fewer variables, just the ancient landscape and my equipment. The silence at 4 in the morning is profound here. It's the kind of silence that feels like presence. I stopped walking immediately after that first scream. Protocol dictates I should have radioed it in, called for backup, initiated a search and rescue response. Instead, I did what so many people do when confronted with the inexplicable. I waited. I listened. I tried to rationalize. Then it came again, closer this time. It wasn't a scream anymore. It was worse. It was almost a voice, but wrong in every fundamental way. The pitch dipped and rose like someone trying to shape human speech through a throat filled with broken glass and ancient hunger. There were notes in it, actual musical tones, that my ear couldn't quite process. My brain kept sliding away from the memory of it, even as I was hearing it, the way an eye refuses to focus on something at the very edge of vision. I pulled my radio from my belt. My hand was shaking. This was not normal. The Appalachian Mountains are not kind, but they're generally predictable in their cruelty. We get bears, we get cougars, we get freak weather and lost hikers and the occasional genuine tragedy that comes from miscalculation and human error. We don't get inexplicable sounds that make your spine feel like it's trying to exit your body through your skin. The static came to life immediately. Marcus at the station. Ranger Walsh, go ahead. I opened my mouth to report the sound, to request backup, to make this official. Instead, I heard myself say, possible animal distress, Blackwater Gorge. I'm going to investigate. Marcus hesitated. Walsh, it's 0400 hours. What kind of distress call? Unidentified. Could be a trapped deer. Could be an injured wildlife. I'll report back in 20 minutes. That was the lie I told that morning. That was the moment when I stepped off the path of reasonable action and into something that would come to define the rest of my life in these mountains. I moved deeper into the gorge. The fog grew thicker as I descended, the beam of my flashlight diffusing into a white glow that illuminated nothing and everything simultaneously. The Blackwater Trail drops steeply into the gorge's heart, a place where the geology fractures into stone formations that geologists called the Devil's Staircase. I'd never found that name particularly reassuring. Then I saw the deer. It was a doe, a relatively young one based on her size, and she was still alive. Still was the operative word. What remained of her hung suspended in the lower branches of a skeletal oak, her body twisted at angles that suggested deliberate breaking rather than any natural trauma. The smell hit me before my mind could fully process what I was seeing. Not rot, not death, but something worse. Something chemical, acetic, like her flesh was still dissolving even after the violence had stopped. I forced myself closer, forcing the beam of my light across her form, cataloging details even as my training was screaming at me to retreat. The skin was stripped in precise patterns. The legs weren't there anymore, and I understood suddenly that whatever had taken them had done so while the animal was still breathing. I was still processing this horror when I heard the breathing. It came from above and behind me, deeper in the fog. Not the harsh, panting respiration of an animal exhausted by predation, but something rhythmic and patient and so profoundly wrong that I couldn't even identify it as breathing at first. It was like the sound of wind moving through a corpse's ribs, like wet fabric being dragged across stone. Like everything that moves through these mountains stripped down to its basest animal sound, then refined and weaponized into something that existed only to inspire terror. I didn't run. I want to tell you that I turned and fled like any sensible person would, that I abandoned the trail and thrashed through the undergrowth back toward civilization. But I didn't. I stood there, my light cutting uselessly through the fog, and I waited. The breathing grew closer, and then, impossibly, I heard a voice. Not the horrible wailing from before, but actual words. Fractured and layered as if multiple voices were speaking in unison but distinctly attempting human language. Ranger. It knew what I was. My radio crackled to life. Marcus checking in. Walsh, 10-minute check-in. What's your status? I tried to speak. My jaw wouldn't respond. I was locked in place, watching the fog, waiting for the shape that must accompany such a presence to finally resolve into visibility. Walsh, come back. I hit the transmit button. I found something, I managed. Something dead. Something that killed something else. Roger that. Requesting confirmation on your status. You okay? I looked down at the doe again. I'm fine. Just surprised by the condition of the remains. I'm going to photograph and file a report. Copy. Return to base at 0530. Walsh out. The radio went silent. The breathing continued. When I turned my flashlight back toward the sound, the fog seemed to have thickened further, growing almost solid. And in that thickness I saw something that I couldn't quite resolve into understanding. A shape. An absence. A place where the fog didn't move quite right. Where the air seemed heavier, more resistant. Hungry. The voice was clearer now, less layered, almost conversational. You are hungry too. I should have run then. God knows I should have. Instead, I asked, what are you? The shape in the fog seemed to expand, and I realized with a horror that bypassed rational thought entirely that it was moving closer, not toward me, but circling me, evaluating me with the patient calculation of something that understood concepts like patience and hunger and the value of prey. We remember you. The voice was almost gentle now, almost kind. We have always been here. We remember when you were not. We will remember when you are gone. The fog rolled in with the speed of a held breath released, and the shape was suddenly too close, looming above the depth of the trail. I could see details now. The outline of something that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human. Limbs that bent wrong. Skin that seemed to catch the light like wet leather. Eyes that weren't eyes at all but voids. Pits of absolute black that drew in light rather than reflecting it. Then my survival instinct finally reasserted itself, and I ran. I don't remember most of the scramble back up the trail. I remember roots that seemed to reach for my ankles, branches that cut across my face, the way my radio kept crackling with Marcus asking for status updates that I couldn't answer. I remember the moment when I burst from the gorge line and the fog released me like a creature spitting out something foul. I remember reaching my truck and sitting in the cab with both doors locked, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't insert the key into the ignition. And I remember the sound, that voice, carrying across the distance as the sun began to lighten the eastern sky. "We will meet again, Ranger." I was still bleeding from where the branches had torn my face when I drove into the station at 5:47 a.m. Marcus took one look at me and knew something more serious had happened than a simple wildlife encounter. My supervisor, a man named Harrison who'd been managing this ranger station for nearly 30 years, pulled me into his office before I could even file my initial report. "You look like you've been through a meat grinder," Harrison said. And he wasn't exaggerating. The scratches on my face were deep enough to need antiseptic and bandages. My uniform was torn. My hands were still shaking despite the gallon of coffee I'd consumed at the station. I told him about the deer. I told him about the sound. I didn't tell him about the breathing, about the voice, about the way something had stood in the fog and spoken my title with the familiarity of something that had been watching me for far longer than this morning's encounter. "We'll need to send someone into the gorge to recover the remains," Harrison said, already reaching for his phone. "Get it to the state wildlife office. Probably some kind of predation behavior we haven't documented yet. They like to know about anomalies." "It wasn't a predation pattern I've ever seen," I said carefully. The lie came easier now. "Yeah, well, that's why we report it. The more data we collect, the better we understand what's moving through these mountains." Harrison paused, studying me. "You good to continue your rounds, or do you need the day off?" I should have taken the day. I should have gone home, locked the doors, and spent the next month trying to convince myself that I'd had a panic attack in the fog and mistaken natural wildlife behavior for something supernatural. Instead, I said, "I'm fine, just startled." By noon, I was at the Regional Wildlife Office in Ashton, a town that clings to the Appalachian foothills like a barnacle to a rock. The facility there isn't large, just a handful of offices and a single large room filled with filing cabinets and reference materials. I'd volunteered to transport the photographs of the remains, which gave me access to their records. I told myself I was just being thorough. I told myself I was looking for logical explanations for what I'd encountered. But really I was trying to confirm that I wasn't insane, that something in the mountains matched the description of what I'd encountered. I spent the afternoon cross-referencing folklore databases. The state office had a surprising amount of material dedicated to Appalachian cryptids and local legends. There were files on Bigfoot sightings, on Mothman encounters from the West Virginia incidents, on the Jersey Devil and various other creatures that occupied the space between wildlife science and folk mythology. It was around 3 p.m. when I found the references to the Wendigo. The material wasn't extensive, mostly historical accounts drawn from Anishinaabe and Algonquian tribal records, mixed with scattered historical accounts from settler narratives. But one detail made my blood run cold. The Wendigo, according to the legends, was a creature born from starvation and desperation. It was a cannibal spirit, drawn to regions where winter hunger had driven people to unspeakable acts. More disturbing than that, the accounts suggested that a Wendigo wasn't just a creature, it was a curse that could be transmitted through consuming human flesh, that once the hunger took root in a person, they could become a Wendigo themselves. But the Wendigo was supposed to be a northern phenomenon. The legends originated in the Great Lakes region, in areas where brutal winters and isolation had spawned stories of creatures born from human desperation. What would it be doing in the Appalachian Mountains? I found the answer in a file labeled with a single word, Shenandoah. The account was from 1887, a settler named Caleb Morrison who had documented an encounter in what would later become Shenandoah National Park. He described a creature that matched every detail of what the indigenous traditions claimed about the Wendigo. The same wrong proportions, the same hunger that went beyond simple predation, the same voice that tried to speak human language but came out wrong, filtered through a throat designed for something other than words. Morrison had written, "The thing's voice was like an echo of civilization filtered through the gullet of hell itself. It spoke my name though I had never heard it speak. It knew things it had no right to know. I understood with terrible clarity that this was not an animal that had wandered into our lands. This was something ancient, something that had always dwelled in these mountains, learning our languages the way a mimic bird learns sound. There was a note in the file, added in a modern hand. Local folklore suggests the creature is drawn to areas of human desperation. Spring of 1887 marked severe famine in the Blue Ridge region. Morrison's account corroborates traditional narratives of Wendigo manifestation during periods of human suffering. My hand was steady as I photographed the documents with my phone, but my mind was not. The Wendigo didn't just hunt. According to the traditions, it fed on something deeper than flesh. It fed on the resonance of human suffering, on the spiritual collapse that came from watching everything you'd built and loved disappear into the darkness of starvation. The last line of Morrison's account sent chills through my entire body. I fear the creature's voice in my dreams more than I fear its presence in the waking world. I fear that I am beginning to understand what it is trying to say. I left the archive at 4:47 p.m. and drove back toward the mountains, my mind constructing theories and rejecting them as quickly as they formed. There had to be a logical explanation. There had to be. By the time I reached the ranger station, Harrison was waiting for me with a frown and a clipboard. "The autopsy on that deer came back," he said without preamble. "The technician flagged something unusual." "What did they find?" "Chemical compounds in the tissue that aren't consistent with any known animal digestive system. They're requesting additional samples from the gorge, expanded parameters. They want to know if we're looking at some kind of environmental contamination or if there's something new in the ecosystem we need to be tracking." I felt the bottom of my stomach drop away. "Harrison, I need to tell you something. I don't think that was a natural predation." My supervisor set down his clipboard and gave me his full attention. "All right, I'm listening." I told him about the historical record. I showed him the photographs from the archive file. I walked him through the Morrison account and the connections between the Wendigo legends and the documented encounter in our region. Harrison listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would shape the rest of my investigation. "My grandfather used to work these mountains. He told me stories about things that weren't in the official records, things that rangers were instructed not to report. He said there were parts of the Appalachian Range where it was better not to go alone, and better still not to go at all." "Did he tell you about the Wendigo?" "Not in those words, no. But he told me about a hunger that was older than the mountains themselves. He said it was sleeping, mostly. That it woke up during the hard times, during the years when desperation filled the hollows and people stopped seeing each other as neighbors." He said. Harrison trailed off, a strange expression crossing his weathered face. "He said the mountains have always fed on something, that the starvation was spiritual before it was physical." I left the station just after dark, driving the long route home through winding mountain roads. My headlights cut through darkness so complete it seemed almost solid. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was running alongside the road, keeping pace with my truck, waiting for the moment when I would slow down or stop, waiting for when the hunger might find an opening. For 3 weeks, I tried to live a normal life. I continued my ranger rounds. I filed reports. I attended the weekly station meetings and pretended that finding the remains of a brutalized deer and encountering something that defied explanation hadn't fundamentally altered the way I perceived the mountains. But the voice never fully left me. It lived in the space between sleep and waking, in the moments of silence before I fell unconscious. It would whisper things, not threats, but observations, about my life, about choices I'd made, about the times in my own history when desperation had skirted me, when the darkness had threatened to overwhelm and I'd only barely pulled myself back from the edge. "We understand hunger," it would say, and there was something almost intimate in the way those words formed. "We understand what it means to want, to need, to know that there is an absence that cannot be filled." I didn't share this with anyone. I know how that would sound. Instead, I became obsessed with the records. I started spending my evening hours at the regional archive, cross-referencing historical accounts. I traced patterns of Wendigo sightings that seemed to follow lines of ecological stress, areas where winters had been brutal, where starvation had marked an entire community. But I also found something else. The sightings weren't random. They clustered in regions where human despair had reached critical mass, and there was a correlation I couldn't ignore. The Wendigo seemed to feed not just on the flesh of isolated individuals, but on entire communities locked in their own collapse. In March of 1922, during the coal mining boom, There were 7 documented disappearances in the hollows east of our current station. The reports were vague: hikers gone missing, miners who didn't return from claims in remote areas. But a journal entry from a parish minister documented a sermon he'd given about a corruption in the mountains, about people behaving in ways that suggested they were becoming something other than human. In 1963, during a particularly harsh winter, there were 3 confirmed cannibalism incidents in the same region, separated by more than 50 miles but following an eerie pattern. Each instance involved individuals found alone after 3 or 4 days of reported isolation, found with evidence of having consumed raw flesh. The official reports cited starvation and psychological breakdown, but the details were disturbing in their similarity. The victims had all claimed to hear voices in the mountains. All had claimed to understand, finally, what the hunger was trying to communicate. And in 1987, almost exactly 100 years after Morrison's encounter, there was a final cluster of incidents. A hiker found wandering the trail system who kept repeating the same phrase: "It's not the cold that kills you, it's the understanding." An entire family in an isolated cabin who staged an apparent murder-suicide that the state police report suggested was influenced by mass delusion related to extreme isolation. That was the most recent official documentation of Wendigo activity. But I began to wonder if the silence since then was actually absence or merely concealment. I was in the archive in early April when I found the most recent entry. It was handwritten, filed in a manila envelope with no dates, no author attribution, just pages of observations that matched my own experience with terrifying accuracy. The voice is becoming clearer. I believe it is learning from me, it is teaching me. The ranger recalls his own moments of hunger, not physical hunger but spiritual emptiness. He understands that the mountains have many hollows, and not all of them are carved from stone. Some are carved from the human heart. The creature showed me something today, a vision, or perhaps a memory so ancient it predates language. I saw the mountains as they were before language, before civilization. I saw what dwelt in the deep hollows before humans came with their desperate need to name and catalog and control. And I understood that the Wendigo is not an invasion into the mountains. The mountains are an invasion into the Wendigo's world. It is not evil, I think. It is simply hungry in a way that has nothing to do with meat or blood. It is hungry for understanding. It is lonely in a way that spans centuries. My hands were shaking as I read those words, because I recognized the handwriting. It was mine, or rather, it would be mine. I've never written those observations. Yet the ink on the page was fresh enough that I could smell it. And the content detailed encounters I hadn't yet experienced, conversations I hadn't yet had. I left the archive running, that thought burning in my mind like a fever. If those observations were really written in my handwriting, then either someone was deliberately imitating my script with impossible precision, or something far more disturbing was true. Something about causality had broken. Something about the Wendigo's influence extended beyond simple predation. That night, I went back to Blackwater Gorge. I told myself I was conducting research. I told myself I was gathering data. But really, I was answering the call that had been growing stronger for 3 weeks. That whisper that had been patient and insistent and increasingly difficult to ignore. I arrived just after midnight, parking at the edge of the trail, hiking in with only my flashlight and a knife I'd pulled from my kitchen drawer before leaving my house. It was an absurd weapon against anything that could do what I'd witnessed, but holding it made me feel less defenseless. The fog was waiting. It rolled down the mountainside like something with purpose, gathering around me within minutes of my arrival at the gorge's edge. And as it thickened, the voice resolved from whisper to clarity. "You came back, you understand now. You are ready to listen." I should have turned and run. I knew that. Some part of my mind was screaming at me to flee, to break radio silence and call for a full emergency response. But I was transfixed by the calm certainty in that voice. It wasn't threatening. It was almost welcoming. "What do you want from me?" I asked aloud. The shape in the fog became visible. That same wrongness of proportion and being. Those eyes that consumed light rather than reflecting it. But this time, I didn't feel pure terror. I felt something else. Something closer to understanding. "We want you to know what we know. To remember what the mountains remember. The civilizations that came before. The hollows filled with starvation and desperation. The mountains are old. and the mountains are hungry, and they have been waiting for someone who could translate between the human world and the world beneath. Translation of what? Of the hunger itself. The creature moved closer, and I realized that its voice was no longer mangled and layered. It was speaking with perfect clarity, perfect human inflection. You are drawn to narrate the stories of the mountains, to transform them into words that carry meaning. We need someone who can do that. We need someone to tell the world that the hunger here is not malevolent. It is simply ancient and lonely and desperate for understanding. I looked at those void eyes, and for the first time I considered the possibility that I might be in the presence of something that wasn't trying to kill me. That might have been the most dangerous moment of all. I spent the night at the gorge. I don't have a clear memory of what happened during those hours, whether we actually spoke, whether the conversations I remember were real or constructed entirely from my own mind's attempt to rationalize the irrational. But by the time dawn broke and the fog receded, something fundamental had changed in me. The Wendigo, if that's what it was, if names even applied to something so far outside human comprehension, had shown me things, memories or visions, or perhaps direct knowledge downloaded directly into my consciousness like information uploaded into a computer. I saw the mountains as they had existed for millions of years. I saw the moment when the first human desperation had entered the hollows, when the first person had looked at starvation and made a choice that changed them fundamentally. And I understood with terrible clarity that the creature had been waiting, not hunting, waiting for someone who could narrate its existence, who could carry its story from the wilderness into the human world in a way that wouldn't trigger the automatic rejection of reason. I reported to the station at my normal time. Marcus was working the radio, and he flagged me immediately. "Walsh, where were you last night? You went off the grid around 2100 hours. Equipment malfunction," I said smoothly. "Had to hike back to the truck to get a replacement unit. I'll file a maintenance report." The lie came easily now, and I realized that was part of what the Wendigo had done to me. It had opened channels of deception so naturally that I could barely feel myself lying anymore. Over the following weeks, I continued to work. I continued to file reports. I continued to move through my life in a way that appeared normal from the outside. But I was also writing. Every evening I would sit at my kitchen table and I would produce pages of observations about the mountains, about the patterns of desperation that seemed to move through the hollows like a contagion, about the way the terrain itself seemed to shape human experience towards starvation and isolation. I began to understand what the creature actually wanted. It wasn't hunger for flesh. The doe in the gorge had just been a teaching tool, a demonstration of what the Wendigo was capable of. What it actually wanted was far more sophisticated and far more disturbing. It wanted to be understood. The creature existed in a state of profound isolation. It had been present in the mountains for as long as the mountains themselves had existed, moving through the hollows and the deep places, feeding on the spiritual collapse of desperate humans, but never truly communicating, never truly being seen for what it was, rather than as a monster to be feared and hunted. The Wendigo wasn't evil. That was the revelation. Evil requires choice, requires moral agency, requires the kind of intentionality that only consciousness can provide. The Wendigo was simply a force of nature, as natural to the Appalachian Mountains as the autumn leaf turn or the spring flood. It was hunger incarnate, yes, but it was also intelligence. It was consciousness that had evolved over millennia in the deep places where human despair pooled like water in a depression, and it had decided that I was the vessel through which it would finally make itself known. I tried to resist. I really did. There were nights when I would lie in bed and feel the weight of what was happening to me, the slow transformation of my mind as the boundaries between my thoughts and the creature's communications grew increasingly blurred. I considered going to someone for help. Harrison, maybe. Or a professional who might be able to help me understand what was happening to my mind. But I also understood that no one would believe me. And more importantly, I understood that the creature wasn't doing anything to me that I didn't on some level want done. It was offering me purpose. It was offering me a reason to exist in these mountains that went beyond the routine of ranger duties and wildlife surveys. It was offering me meaning. By May, I had filled 7 notebooks with observations and narratives about the Wendigo and its relationship to the Appalachian Mountains. I had documented the historical record, traced the patterns of despair that seemed to activate its presence, and created a comprehensive narrative of a consciousness that existed parallel to human consciousness, touching it at points of weakness and desperation. And one evening, sitting at the overlook above Blackwater Gorge, I realized that I was no longer afraid. The voice came to me as I watched the sun set behind distant ridgelines, painting the hollows in shades of purple and deep blue. You understand now. You are almost ready. Ready for what? I asked aloud, though I already knew the answer. Ready to become us? Ready to translate your hunger into the hunger of the mountains. You have documented us, narrated us, brought us into the realm of language and human consciousness. But the final translation requires more. It requires that you step across the threshold, that you consume what you will, that you understand hunger not as external force but as internal transformation. I thought of Morrison's final account, of the family in the cabin in 1987, of all the documented instances where human desperation had tipped into something darker, something the medical and legal establishments had tried to explain away as starvation-induced psychosis. If I do this, I said slowly, if I allow the transformation, what happens to me? You become the voice of the mountains. You become the translation between worlds. You become hunger with purpose, consciousness with direction. You become what the Wendigo has been waiting for, not a victim, not prey, but a partner in the work of making itself understood. The temptation in those words was almost overwhelming. To transcend the mundane boundaries of human existence. To become something greater, something with meaning that spans centuries. But I also understood, in that moment, what the creature had hidden from me during our prior encounters. The transformation wasn't evolution, it was consumption. The Wendigo didn't partner with humans. It incorporated them, dissolved them into itself, used their consciousness as a tool to better understand and infiltrate the human world while erasing the human that had once existed. And it would do this to others, to Harrison, to Marcus, to anyone else in these mountains who let their guard down, who allowed themselves a moment of connection with the strange presence that dwelt in the deep hollows. I looked out at the mountains I dedicated 12 years of my life to protecting, and I made my choice. I reported myself to Harrison the next morning. I told him everything. The encounter, the voice, the notebooks, the way I could feel the creature's presence moving through my thoughts like water seeping into stone. I expected him to call for a psychological evaluation. Instead, he listened to my entire account, and when I finished, he stood and walked to a locked cabinet in his office. From it, he withdrew a journal, worn, old, dating back to the 1960s based on the year written on the cover. "This belonged to my grandfather," he said quietly. "He left it to me before he died. Told me to read it only if I ever encountered something in these mountains that defied explanation." He documented his own encounters with the Wendigo, and he documented what had to be done about it. The solution was harsh and absolute. The Wendigo existed in a state of partial manifestation, dwelling between the physical and the purely spiritual. It couldn't truly die, not in any conventional sense, but it could be denied access to consciousness. It could be closed out. The mountainous terrain around the gorge had what his grandfather called thin places, areas where the boundary between material reality and spiritual reality was porous. These areas were also places where human desperation had historically pooled, where the creature had found easiest access to consciousness and transformation. The solution involved controlled burning of these regions, combined with repeated ritual recitation of specific phrases designed to reinforce the boundary between worlds. It was part ecological management, part spiritual warfare, and entirely outside the bounds of anything official environmental policy would ever approve. But more importantly, it required that I serve as the focal point. The creature had chosen me as its conduit. That connection had to be destroyed, and it couldn't be destroyed without my cooperation. I had to willingly break the linkage, had to consciously reject the narrative I'd been constructing, had to step back from the threshold. That night, I returned to Blackwater Gorge alone. The fog was waiting, rolling down like a greeting. "You've made your decision," the voice came. Not a question, but a statement. "I have," I said. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that connection is never re-established. I'm going to tend these mountains in a way that denies you the access you've been seeking. I'm going to work with others like Harrison, like the family that's been guarding this secret for generations, to keep the boundary intact. There was a moment of profound silence. Then, for the first time since I'd encountered it, I heard something that might have been grief in that voice. "We were so alone. We thought you would understand." "I do understand," I said, and it was true. I understood the creature's loneliness, its desire for connection, its hunger for consciousness and recognition, and that understanding made what I had to do even harder. But understanding and allowing are two different things. I spent the next 6 months working with Harrison and a small network of people, former rangers, local indigenous community members, spiritual practitioners whose methods I'd never have believed in before, to accomplish what needed to be done. We burned the thin places carefully, methodically, allowing the ecological recovery I told the official agencies was necessary. We repeated rituals and recitations that I still don't fully understand, but that seemed designed to reinforce barriers, to strengthen the separation between human consciousness and whatever dwelt in the deep places of the mountains. And I never returned to Blackwater Gorge. But I finished this account in hopes that someone else, someday, would understand what I encountered. The Wendigo was real. The creature dwelling in the Appalachian Mountains was real. And it was not the simple monster of folklore. It was something far more complex. A consciousness born from the world itself, seeking connection with the human minds that occasionally dwelled in its domain. The mountains are still here. The hollows still exist. And somewhere in the deep places where desperation pools and starvation writes its story across the landscape, something ancient continues to wait. It understands hunger, and it is nothing if not patient. The trail map said Blackwater Hollow should have been impassable in October. That's the only reason I thought I was safe taking it alone. I'd been working the eastern sections of the Appalachian Preserve for 7 years, marking trails, maintaining the ranger stations, keeping people out of the places that shouldn't be visited. My supervisor, Ridge, had warned me that week about poachers moving through the northern ridges. "Stay sharp," he'd said. I took that warning and decided to do a full perimeter check myself. Wouldn't need backup for that kind of work. Just me, my rifle, and the mountains I'd come to know better than my own home. The first sign was the smell, not the normal decay you find in old forests. Animal bones, fallen trees decomposing into the earth. This was different, metallic and wrong. Like copper left in direct sunlight too long, mixed with something organic that had rotted from the inside out. I found it near the eastern access point, drifting down from the ridge where the hemlocks grew so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The pines around me had fallen silent. No birds, no insects. Just wind through dead branches and my own breathing. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a howl. It came from somewhere up on the ridge, broken and pained, like something was being torn apart from the inside. I've heard elk calls, mountain lions, bears caught in traps. This was none of those things. This was something that had lungs and a throat but shouldn't be using them that way. I climbed. My boots found purchase on the rocky slope where the forest opened up briefly, a clearing maybe 15 feet across where nothing grew. The earth was dark and wet, though it hadn't rained in 3 days. I knelt down and touched it. Warm, still warm when it should have been cold. The smell was stronger here, making my eyes water. That's when I saw Hudson. His name was Hudson Keyes, according to the missing person report that came through our station 2 weeks prior. He'd been a hiker visiting from out of state. Young kid, probably mid-20s, came to the mountains alone for a spiritual journey, whatever that meant. The search team had called off the effort after 4 days. In these mountains, 4 days is basically a life sentence. He was hung in the hemlocks, not hung with rope. Hung by his own insides. His abdomen had been opened with the precision of something that knew exactly where to cut, where the meat was thickest and most useful. And he was suspended by thin strips of his own sinew looped over the low branches. His face was gone, not eaten, gone. Like it had been carefully removed and carried away for collection. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I stood there for what might have been hours, might have been seconds, while my brain tried to process what my eyes were showing it. The body was maybe 3 days old. The flies had found it. The smell rolled off Hudson in waves, and underneath that metallic corruption was something else, something that smelled like hunger. That's when I heard it again. The screaming. This time it was closer. It came from the far side of the ridge, up where the trail dissolved into unmarked forest. And underneath that sound, underneath the pain and the wrongness, I heard something that froze my blood completely still. I heard it eating, the sound of something massive tearing through meat, the crack of bone, the wet, rhythmic sounds of consumption. And beneath all of it, something that almost sounded like pleasure, satisfaction, like whatever was making those sounds had found a meal and was taking its time with the experience. I ran. I know that's not what people expect to hear from someone in my position. Rangers are supposed to be brave, to investigate, to protect. But I had looked into that place where Hudson hung, and I knew with absolute certainty that something was wrong in these mountains. Something that wore the shape of hunger in a way I'd never encountered in all my years in this job. The trail back down took me 2 hours, twice as long as it should have, because I kept stopping to listen. Each time I stopped, I heard it. The crash of something enormous moving through the forest. The sound of breaking wood. Twice, I heard that scream again. And once, I heard what sounded like laughter. High and keening and completely devoid of any human emotion. By the time I reached the ranger station, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the lock. Ridge found me the next morning. I'd called him at 4 in the morning, voice raw from screaming. Not just telling him what I'd found, but screaming every other detail as well. The way Hudson's body had been positioned, the precision of the cuts, that impossible scream that didn't belong to anything in any catalog of Appalachian wildlife. "You look like hell," Ridge said when he got to the station. He was a big man, ex-military, the kind of person who didn't rattle, but he rattled that morning. His jaw was tight as he read my statement. "You're sure about what you saw?" "I know a human body," I told him. "I know what happens to one when an animal takes it. This was different." Different how? I couldn't explain it. Couldn't put into words the precision of those cuts, the way the body had been hung with a kind of purposefulness, like it was a display, like it was a message. Ridge called the state police. I had to tell the story again for 3 different officers, each one looking more skeptical than the last. They collected the body. They found more signs in the forest, claw marks that were too large to be any native species, drag marks that suggested something weighed over 400 pounds, and scattered throughout the area, things that looked like altars, circles of stones, arrangements of bones, all pointing inward, towards something deeper in the forest. That's when one of the officers mentioned the legend. "Wendigo," he said casually, like he was reading from a field guide instead of speaking of something that shouldn't exist. Old Appalachian folklore, creature of hunger. Some of the old families still leave offerings in the deep places, trying to keep it satisfied, keep it away from the settlements. I'd laughed. Actually laughed. "You can't be serious." "The cuts on the body," he continued, "they're consistent with some of the old case files from 50 years ago. Same precision, same positioning, same message." "What message?" I demanded. He looked at me with something that might have been pity. "That it's feeding, and that it's still hungry." 3 days after they found Hudson, I was supposed to take a week off. Standard procedure after witnessing something traumatic. Ridge basically ordered me to go, said he didn't want to see me back at the station for at least 7 days. I spent 4 of those days in my cabin, staring at nothing, replaying that moment when I looked into Hudson's hollow face. Then I did something stupid. I went back to the clearing, not the spot where Hudson hung. I'm not that much of a fool. But I went back to the trail system, brought my camera, and documented every discovery in that northeastern quadrant. The circles of stones, the bones arranged in patterns, the strange symbols carved into tree bark, marks that almost looked like writing but belonged to no alphabet I'd ever seen. That's when I met Julian. Julian Cross was a local historian, lived in the small town of Eastmark about 15 miles from the preserve. I'd seen him around the station occasionally. He was always nosing around, asking questions about the old families and their traditions. This time he found me. "You found something," he said. It wasn't a question. I was photographing a particularly complex arrangement of deer bones when he stepped out of the forest. Quiet, too quiet, like he'd been following me. "How did you—" "Hudson wasn't the first," Julian said. "He was an older man, maybe 70s, with the kind of weathered skin that came from spending a lifetime outdoors. And he won't be the last. Not unless someone understands what's happening." I didn't want to believe him. Didn't want to believe in a creature that shouldn't exist. But standing there in that forest, surrounded by evidence of something unnatural, I found myself listening. Julian told me the story. The Wendigo, the real one, not the folklore, had come to these mountains sometime before the Civil War. It was old then, Julian said, older than white settlement. It had learned to exist in harmony with the mountain itself, taking only what it needed, only what was offered. For generations, the old families, the ones who still kept to the old traditions, made offerings at specific times. Food, animals, supplies, anything to keep the hunger satisfied and the creature at a distance. But times had changed. People moved away. Young generations stopped believing. The offerings stopped coming. It's been getting hungry again, Julian said. For the past 15 years there have been disappearances. Hikers mostly. People passing through who don't understand what these mountains demand. And the creature is getting bolder, getting closer to the settled places. This is insane, I said. But even as I said it, I was photographing the bones, recording coordinates, documenting everything. You've seen it, Julian said. It wasn't a question, or seen what it leaves behind. I told him about Hudson, about that impossible scream, about the laughter. Julian nodded slowly. It's testing the boundaries, seeing how far it can come down the mountain without consequence. It's planning something. What do you mean, planning? It's an animal. It's not an animal, Julian said quietly. Not anymore. Hunger changes things. Hunger for so long without satisfaction. It teaches. It learns. It dreams. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to contain decades of terrible knowledge. And right now, it's dreaming of the town, of all those people, all that meat. Over the next week, I met with Julian multiple times. He showed me records, old newspaper clippings from the 1950s describing the disappearance epidemic in the region. 5 people vanished in a single month. The National Guard was called in. They found nothing. After the offerings resumed, the disappearances stopped. There were similar patterns in the 1920s, the 1890s. Always the same cycle. When the offerings stopped, people started disappearing. When they resumed, the creature retreated. We have to restore the offerings, Julian said. I told him he was crazy. I told him I was going to report him as unstable. But the truth was, I'd started to believe. The evidence was too specific, too consistent, too real. The problem was, I had no idea how to restart a tradition that had been dead for 50 years. Neither did Julian. That's when Thomas showed up. Thomas Hardwick was 93 years old and hadn't left his homestead in the mountains in nearly 70 years. Julian brought me to him, an old cabin perched on a hillside overlooking a valley so deep you could barely see the bottom. The kind of place that felt like it existed slightly outside of normal geography. Thomas knew the rituals. His grandmother had performed them. His mother, his sister, before she died. The offerings had to be made at specific times, certain phases of the moon, certain days marked on the old calendars that didn't match any modern schedule. They had to be left at the stone circles. There were 5 of them scattered throughout the deep forest. And they had to be made with intention, with understanding. It's a contract, Thomas explained, sitting on his porch while evening fell around us. An old one, older than any of our families. The creature and the people bound together. It gets what it needs. We get to live. What happens if we don't restart the offerings, I asked. Thomas looked at me like the answer should have been obvious. It gets hungrier. We made the first offering 3 days later. Thomas insisted on leading us. Said the mountains needed to hear his voice, needed to recognize that someone still remembered the old ways. We carried supplies to the nearest stone circle, a clearing in the deep forest where 5 massive boulders stood in a perfect geometric pattern that couldn't possibly have occurred naturally. We left the offerings in the center, fresh venison, harvested and prepared with care, a case of preserved foods, fruits and vegetables put up the old way, the way Thomas's ancestors had done it. And something that made me deeply uncomfortable, a note, written on old paper in Thomas's shaky handwriting. It said simply, "The contract is remembered. The offerings resume. The hunger will be satisfied." As the sun set, we heard it, a sound from deep in the forest. Not a scream this time, something almost like approval. A low, resonant hum that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It made my teeth ache. It made my vision blur. And then, in the darkness, we saw movement. Something impossibly large moved through the forest, just beyond the range of our lanterns. It was there and then it wasn't. But I saw enough. I saw the suggestion of enormous shoulders, the curve of something that might have been a spine, the gleam of eyes that were far too intelligent. Thomas didn't run. He stood there, watching as the shape moved through the darkness, and I realized with dawning horror that they knew each other. That this wasn't the first time in recent months that an old man from the mountains had made an offering to the thing that lived in the deep places. When it was gone, Thomas turned to me with sadness in his eyes. "Now we wait," he said. "The offerings will hold it for a time. But hunger is a patient thing, and if the new generation doesn't step up, if they don't remember the contract." He trailed off, but the meaning was clear. The creature would feed again. The offerings held for 6 weeks. I know this because during those 6 weeks there were no disappearances, no new bodies. The forest, which had begun to feel actively dangerous, settled into something almost normal. Almost. I'd been working with Thomas and Julian to expand the offerings, to bring more of the old families back into the practice. It wasn't easy. Most of the descendants of those mountain families had left generations ago, moved to cities, assimilated. Getting them to believe in something their rational minds said couldn't exist required patience and evidence. But the evidence was mounting. Hikers started reporting sightings in the deep forest. Not of the creature itself, but of things that spoke to its presence. A shattered backpack hanging from a tree, completely empty. Clothing arranged in patterns too precise to be random. And once, a campsite that had been completely dismantled. Every piece of gear taken except for a journal, left open to a single passage. "It's here. It's always been here. I understand now." The hiker, a woman named Evelyn, had been found safe in Eastmark 3 days later, unable to speak or remember anything. When she finally began to communicate again, weeks later in the hospital, she could only repeat one phrase: "The contract must be kept. The contract must be kept." Then, in the 7th week, something changed. I was at the ranger station reviewing reports when Ridge came in looking grave. "We've got a situation," he said. "Multiple reports of howling coming from the northern ridge. Families are getting scared. We might need to call in wildlife management." The howling was different this time. Not the animal sounds I'd heard before. These were almost human, almost like words. I grabbed my equipment and headed into the forest, knowing exactly where I'd find the source. The northern ridge, at the center of the stone circles. What I found was a scene from a nightmare. Blood. Everywhere. But no bodies. The offerings we'd left, all of them, from all 5 circles, had been consumed, but not peacefully. The scene looked like a struggle, like the creature had been in pain. Julian and Thomas were already there when I arrived, both looking frightened in a way I'd never seen before. "It's sick," Thomas said simply. "What do you mean, sick?" "Look." He pointed at the ground. The blood wasn't entirely red. Mixed in were traces of something else, something that looked almost like phosphorescence, glowing faintly in the dim forest light. The offerings had been desecrated, some of them arranged in patterns that looked like language. Julian showed me his notebook. He'd been photographing and documenting these patterns for days. "It's communicating," he said. "I don't know how, but it's trying to tell us something." Over the course of that night, we pieced together what we could of the message. The arrangement of the torn offerings, the patterns in the blood, the symbols scratched into the bark of nearby trees. It was fragmentary and disturbing, but the intent became clear. The creature was in pain. The offerings were no longer sufficient. Something had changed, either in its physiology or in its needs, and the traditional sustenance wasn't working anymore. It needed something more, something stronger. "It's evolving," I said, the words sounding insane even as I spoke them. "It's changing, or it's lying," Thomas said quietly, "testing to see if we'll offer more. Offer different things." But we both knew he didn't believe that. Over the next week, more messages appeared, each one more desperate than the last. The creature, which we'd stopped calling the Wendigo and started referring to simply as the Hunger, was becoming erratic. It stopped responding to the offerings entirely. Instead, it began to hunt. A family of hikers vanished from the Eastern Trail. 2 days later, their campsite was found arranged in a display that was unmistakably a message, a circle of their own belongings, positioned like a question. In the center, a single article of clothing, a child's jacket, placed with something that looked almost like guilt. The subtext was clear: "I'm taking them anyway. There's nothing you can do." Julian contacted a woman named Caroline. She was connected to what was left of the old mountain families, lived in a settlement deeper in the hills than I'd ever been allowed to go. Caroline was old, probably older than Thomas, and she knew things that had been kept secret for generations. "It's starving," Caroline said when we met her, in a cabin that seemed to exist in perpetual shadow despite the afternoon sun outside. "The creature, it's starving from the inside." The offerings were a management system, not a solution. They kept it from hunting beyond a certain boundary. "But if they stop," she looked at us each in turn. "If they stop, there's nothing between it and everything else." "What do we do?" I asked. "There's an older ritual," Caroline said slowly. "Older than the offerings. My grandmother told me about it, said it was done once, long ago, when the creature was first bargained with. It requires a sacrifice. Not food, not livestock, a person." I stood up to leave. "No, if you don't," Caroline said calmly, "it will take them anyway. It will take them and keep taking them until there's nothing left. The creature is breaking its contract. That requires an answer." "I won't be part of this," I said. But even as I said it, I was thinking of Evelyn, the hiker who couldn't stop repeating her message. I was thinking of the family of hikers, of Hudson, hung in the hemlocks like a piece of art. "You're already part of it," Caroline said. "You became part of it the moment you found Hudson. Now you have to decide. Do you save a stranger, or do you let it feed on the whole region until there's nothing left but fear?" That night, I didn't sleep. I never intended to volunteer. That's not how it happened. But I think, in some way, I always knew it would come to this. I'd walked into that forest looking for evidence of a poacher. I'd found something far worse, and in finding it, I'd entered into a contract of my own. One written in blood and screaming and the terrible knowledge that some things can't be stopped, only redirected. Thomas understood first. When I told him what I was going to do, he didn't try to stop me. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting this all along. "The ritual has to be willing," he said. "The creature will know if it's forced. The sacrifice has to be a choice, has to be an offering." Julian argued with me for 6 hours straight. He brought up every logical reason why what I was proposing was insane. But underneath all his logic, I could see the relief. Relief that he wouldn't have to volunteer, that his life would be spared, that someone else, this strange ranger who'd somehow become guardian of a terrible secret, would take the burden instead. Caroline prepared me for the ritual. It involved fasting for 3 days, speaking certain phrases, words in a language I didn't recognize but pronounced exactly as she taught me. The words tasted like copper in my mouth, like old blood, like truth spoken backward. On the 3rd day, I walked into the forest. The stone circles would have been my destination, but I never reached them. I didn't have to. The creature was waiting for me. It had known I was coming. Caroline had told me it would. The offering had been announced through the ritual words. The hunger was patient. It could wait. I found myself in a clearing I'd never seen before, though I'd walked these mountains for 7 years. The trees here were wrong. Too tall, too twisted. Their bark looked almost like skin, and the sky above was a shade of gray that had no name, that seemed to come from inside my own mind rather than from natural light. The creature emerged from between the trees. I'm not going to try to describe it. I've had months to prepare for this moment, and I still don't have the words. What I saw was partially hidden, partially revealed, existing in the space between what I could comprehend and what drove comprehension mad. It was enormous. It moved wrong. It was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food, and everything to do with a void inside itself that could never be filled. And when it looked at me with eyes that contained centuries of knowledge and loneliness, I understood what the creature was. It was lonely. In all my preparation, all my research into the folklore and the legends and the contracts, I'd never understood that the hunger wasn't evil. It was simply alone, ancient, bound to these mountains by something older than language, forced to exist in isolation, fed scraps by people who feared and despised it. We stood there, man and creature, for time that didn't function according to normal rules. And then I spoke. Not the ritual words, not Caroline's incantations, just words, plain words. Why did you take them? The hikers, the families. You broke the contract. The creature made a sound, not a scream this time, something closer to speech. When it came out of its throat, my ears tried to translate it into language my mind could accept. What I heard was, alone, so long alone, The offerings stopped being enough because I stopped being able to accept them. The isolation, it was eating me from inside. "So you came down the mountain," I said. "For the first time in centuries," the creature replied. "To see them, your people, to remember what it was like to be less than what I've become, to be among beings that don't carry the weight of immortal hunger." I realized then that the offerings had never been a management system. They were charity, pity. The old families leaving scraps for a creature they feared, hoping it would stay away. But the real reason the hunger needed them was loneliness. "What if," I said slowly, "the contract changed?" The creature's entire body shifted. A ripple ran through whatever it was made of. "Explain. What if instead of offerings left its circles, there was understanding? What if the people who live here knew what you were, knew why you needed to exist? What if instead of fear there was acknowledgement?" The creature made that sound again. This time, I understood it might have been laughter. "They would never accept that." "Some would," I said. "The old families, Thomas, Julian, Caroline, they already know. What if they helped others know? What if we changed the contract from one of silence and fear to one of knowledge and respect?" "And what is the cost of that knowledge?" the creature asked. "There's always a cost." I walked forward. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I walked into the space between the creature's hands, if they could be called hands, and when it closed them around me, it wasn't with violence, it was almost gentle. "The cost," I said, "is that I'm still here. I haven't disappeared. Tomorrow I go back to the station. I file a report about unusual wildlife activity. I recommend further study, and I become the bridge between your world and theirs. I carry the knowledge forward." The creature, the hunger, held me for a long moment. Then it released me. "Go," it said. "Tell them the contract is changed. Tell them the hunger remembers. And tell them that if understanding is kept, then offerings can be for something other than fear." I walked out of that clearing as the sun was setting. Thomas was waiting for me at the trailhead. He looked at me and nodded, like he'd always known I'd come back. Like he'd been preparing for someone to bridge that gap all his life. "Did it work?" Julian asked, meeting us at the ranger station. "I don't know yet," I said. "But we're going to find out together." That was 6 months ago. The disappearances have stopped. New hikers still vanish occasionally. Those are tragic accidents, the kind that happen in remote wilderness everywhere. But the intentional taking, the messages in blood, the careful displays, that's over. Instead, there are encounters. Sightings, increased wildlife activity that the official reports attribute to a growing population of large predators. A few people have disappeared into the deep forest, seeking understanding, and most have come back changed, different, carrying knowledge they can never quite explain to people who haven't seen what they've seen. The old families are returning. Not physically, most of them never will. But their descendants are returning to the mountains, to the rituals, to the contract. The offerings have changed. They're not placed at circles anymore. They're left with intention, with respect, with a kind of acknowledgement. And sometimes, on clear nights when the wind is right, I hear it. That sound that might be the creature moving through the forest. But it's different now. Less desperate, less hungry, more like longing. Last week, Thomas asked me when I was going to let someone else take over as the bridge. "This burden wasn't meant for one person," he said. "It was meant for a community." I told him I'd train someone. Julian's daughter has already expressed interest. She was born in the mountains, left for the city, and came back asking questions about the folklore that never made sense to her until she started reading my reports. But that's a different story. That's the future of the new contract. For now, I'm just the ranger who found Hudson in the hemlocks. The man who walked into the forest and came back different. The bridge between what we know and what we're learning to accept. And every night when I lie in my cabin on the edge of the preserve, I listen to the mountains breathe around me. I listen to the wind in the hemlocks. And sometimes I hear that impossible sound, the thing that might be laughter, might be hunger, might be something we don't have a name for yet. The contract is kept. The offering is made. And the boundary between our world and the ancient things that live in the deep places remains. Thin but present, held together by understanding instead of fear. That's all I can offer these mountains now. And somehow I think it might be enough. The smell hit me first. Not the autumn decay you expect from dead leaves and distant wood smoke, But something else, something wrong, like meat left to spoil in July heat, mixed with ammonia and wet fur that had never dried. I was 2 miles into my perimeter check at Ridge Walker State Forest when I first caught it, and every instinct I'd developed in 15 years as a park ranger screamed at me to turn back. I didn't. My name is Carter, and that decision nearly got me killed. The mountains here in eastern Kentucky don't forgive mistakes. They're indifferent to them, which is somehow worse. 3,000-foot ridges wrapped in rhododendron thickets, ravines that drop 600 feet straight down, caves that go so deep park surveyors gave up mapping them decades ago. I knew these mountains the way most people know their houses, or at least I thought I did. It was late October, that weird window when summer still clings to the lowlands while winter buries the peaks. The leaves had turned the color of dried blood, rust reds and angry oranges under a sky that couldn't decide between clear and threatening. The weather report said clear, but weather reports in the Appalachians are polite suggestions, not facts. I'd been running the morning patrol route alone because my partner Hudson had called in sick, probably hungover. Hudson had been sinking deeper into whatever bottle he could find since his wife left him 3 months ago. I didn't blame him exactly. The mountains wore people down in ways that weren't always visible until they broke. The trail marker, a white blaze on a hickory tree, was exactly where it should be. I was checking game trail activity, looking for signs of the wild pigs that had been decimating native plants. What I found instead was a deer, or what was left of one. It wasn't like anything I'd seen in 2 decades of patrol work. Not a normal kill. The body was 7 feet from the trail, partially hidden in a tangle of mountain laurel. The head was still attached, which was something, but everything else was methodical in a way that made my skin crawl. The animal had been gutted from sternum to pelvis. The cavity opened with precision. Claw marks, yes, clearly claw marks. 4 parallel lines deeper than any bear I'd ever seen, raked down the inside of the ribs. The smell got stronger as I approached. I should have radioed it in, called it up to the district office, and gone back to the ranger station for lunch while someone from wildlife came to investigate. That's what protocol said. That's what the voice in the back of my head was screaming. Instead, I went deeper. The deer was a 3-point buck, maybe 200 pounds, recently killed. Still warm inside, which meant the smell was fresh decomposition, maybe 6 hours old. Whatever killed it had been feeding. There were bite marks on the hindquarters, but the teeth pattern was too large, the bite radius too wide. I pulled out my notebook, photographed the scene with my phone, and marked the GPS coordinates. That's when I heard it. Not a scream, something worse. A sound that didn't quite fit the mammal category, a kind of elongated wheeze that ended in a noise like wind through a broken window. It came from up the ridge, maybe a quarter mile away, somewhere in the thick laurel hell that made that particular slope nearly impassable. I stood there, listening, every muscle tensed. The sound came again. Closer. It was Hudson who appeared on the trail 20 minutes later, which was strange because Hudson was supposed to be home in bed nursing a hangover. He looked worse than I expected, gaunt, pale, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in a week. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, and there were scratch marks on his neck. Deep ones, the kind that needed more than a cursory glance. "Jesus, Hudson," I said. "What happened to you?" He didn't answer right away, just stared past me toward the dead buck. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "Did you hear it?" "Hear what?" "The sound. The singing. Don't you hear it?" I hadn't heard singing. I'd heard that terrible wheeze, that broken window wail. But Hudson's face had shifted into something I didn't recognize. Not fear exactly, but something stranger. Like he was listening to something I couldn't perceive. Something happening in a frequency above normal hearing. "Hudson, we need to get you to..." I stopped myself. Couldn't say doctor. "We need to get you back to the station." "I've been up all night," he said, still staring at nothing. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd come in early. Thought I'd check the North Ridge." He finally looked at me, and the whites of his eyes were shot through with red. "There's something up there, Carter. Something that shouldn't be." I reached for his arm, but he pulled away. "It's getting close to dark," Hudson said. "We should go. We should be back at the station before dark." For once, I agreed with him completely. The mistake I made, the real mistake, not just going deeper into the forest, happened at 5:47 p.m., according to the timestamp on my phone. We'd made it back to the ranger station. Hudson had washed the scratches on his neck and claimed he'd caught them on a low branch, disoriented in the fog that was rolling in thick through the valleys. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 4 hours. The sky, which had been clearish at noon, had turned the color of old bruises. I'd suggested he take the next day off, maybe see someone about those scratches. He'd just nodded and made coffee with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested his mind was somewhere else entirely. I was pulling together the incident report on the dead buck when my phone rang. It was dispatch, which was unusual. Dispatch called on the radio, not phones. The dispatcher was Rachel, who'd been handling communications for 5 years. Her voice was tight. "Carter, we've got a hiker report from the Black Rock Trail. Visitor named Jess reported seeing something unusual about 2 miles in. She used the emergency call box at the ridgeline overlook." "What kind of unusual?" I asked. "She said there was something large moving through the trees, something that wasn't a bear." Those were her words. She sounded frightened, really frightened. "I've got Isaac headed out in the truck to get her, but we're 7 miles out. Might be a while." Isaac was one of the seasonal rangers, barely 23, fresh out of his training. Good kid, but inexperienced. Still, this was probably nothing. A mountain lion, maybe misidentified. People saw shadow and movement, and fear gave them details that weren't really there. "I'll head to the overlook," I said. "Meet Isaac there. We can coordinate the pickup." "Thanks, Carter. I'll keep you updated." I signed off and looked over at Hudson. He was staring at his cooling coffee, but his right leg was bouncing with nervous energy. "I'll ride with you," he said. It wasn't really a question. We should have taken separate vehicles, should have left someone at the station, should have waited for backup. But the sun was sinking fast, and I wanted to move. The mountain felt wrong that day, the way it sometimes did before a storm. Like the air pressure was all off, and every animal was holding its breath. The drive to Ridgeline Overlook took 12 minutes from the station. We climbed 2,200 feet in elevation, winding through switchbacks and past scenic pullouts where tourists usually crowded in the summer. Today it was empty except for a few cars, probably through hikers who'd picked the overlook as their last stop before heading into the backcountry. Jess was waiting with her hiking partner, a thin man named Eric who looked equally shaken. They were both in their 60s, properly equipped with the kind of gear that suggested they actually knew what they were doing. "We were coming back from the waterfall," Jess explained, showing me the route on my park map. "About 2 miles in, maybe 2.2 miles, where the path narrows before the creek crossing. That's when we heard it. A sound like breathing, but it was huge, you know? The kind of sound that comes from something very large." "How far away?" I asked. 20 feet? 30? It was in the rhododendrons, but we couldn't see it clearly. Just movement. And then, she trailed off, looking at Eric. "Then the trees moved," Eric said. "Not like wind. Like something was pushing through them. The trunks were bending. We just ran. Walked as fast as we could back up the trail." Hudson stepped closer to the overlook railing, staring out at the ridgeline where the sun was turning everything red and gold. "Did it follow you?" he asked. "No," Jess said. "No, thank God. But there's something out there. Something big." I radioed Isaac and told him to hold position at the trailhead, to wait for my call before coming in. Then I sent Eric and Jess back to their car with instructions to head out before dark, to not stop for anything. "Come on," I told Hudson. "Let's check the trail." "You shouldn't go alone," Hudson said, and something in his tone made me look at him. There was something desperate in his face, something almost pleading. "Don't go alone, Carter. Promise me you won't go alone." "You're coming with me," I said. It wasn't a promise so much as a statement of fact. The trail entrance was lit by what remained of the sunset. The air was noticeably colder now, and the trees seemed taller, their canopy thicker. My flashlight cut a bright line through the growing dusk. Hudson stayed close behind me, too close, like he was afraid I'd disappear. We found the creek crossing about 40 minutes into the hike. The water was maybe a foot deep, clear enough to see the rounded stones at the bottom. The rhododendrons pressed in from both sides, their leaves glossy and dark. This was where Jess and Eric had turned back. The tracks started just past the creek. At first I thought they were human. Large feet, deeper impression at the heel than at the toe. A consistent gait. But as I followed them backward, retracing them up the trail, something changed. The spacing began to widen. The foot arch became less distinct. The impressions started to show something that looked almost like a claw mark at the toe. "Oh God," Hudson breathed. "What is it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The tracks change, Hudson said. His voice had dropped to a whisper. Look at where it transitions. From here to there. The shape changes. He was right. About 15 feet apart, the impression shifted. What had started as something almost bipedal, almost human, began to show more spacing between the digits, deeper claw marks. The gate widened into something that suggested it was moving on all fours. Something was running, I said. Something was chasing something else, or something was changing, Hudson said. The temperature had dropped another 20 degrees. My breath was visible now, small clouds in the beam of my flashlight. Above us, the canopy had gotten so thick that the sunset had disappeared completely. The light was fading toward genuine darkness, the kind of darkness you get in the deep woods when the clouds move in and the moon hasn't risen yet. We should go back, Hudson said. And this time, there was no suggestion in his voice. It was pure command. Fear and command, layered together. But I wasn't looking at the tracks anymore. I was looking at what the tracks led to. The trail bent sharp left around a ridge outcropping. On the stone face of that outcrop, at about 7 feet high, was blood. A lot of blood, dark and wet. It had been brushed there like someone had slammed something against the rock, or like something had scraped itself against it while moving fast. There was something else too. Carved or scratched into the stone, crude but unmistakable. A symbol. Lines forming a kind of angular spiral. The kind of thing you might see in old Appalachian folklore drawings. The kind of thing that didn't belong. I was reaching up to photograph it when Hudson grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. We leave now, he said. Carter, we leave right now. I'm not kidding. We do not stay out here after dark. Not on this trail. Not anywhere. We get in the truck and we drive back to the station and we report exactly nothing of this. Report nothing? Hudson, something's out here. Something that what? Hudson's eyes were wild now, dilated, almost black in the fading light. What are you going to report? We saw strange tracks? We saw some old carving on a rock? Who do you think is going to come out here at night? Who do you think is going to believe you? He was right, but it didn't matter. Because that's when we heard the sound. The wheeze wail I'd heard earlier, that horrible broken window shriek, but this time it was close. This time it came from above us, from somewhere on the ridge itself. It echoed down the mountainside in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint distance or direction. All I knew was that it was coming from something massive, something whose lungs were too large, whose throat was shaped all wrong. It was answered by another sound, this one from farther up the trail, and then another from behind us. They were surrounding us. Run, Hudson said. We didn't make it back to the truck with our minds intact. I can't describe the run back down the trail with any kind of coherence. There were moments I didn't understand, gaps where I seemed to have moved from one place to another without memory of the distance between. I remember Hudson behind me, then Hudson in front of me, then Hudson not visible at all, though I could hear his breathing and his boots on the trail. I remember the sounds following us, or maybe surrounding us, or maybe coming from inside my own head. I remember branches that seemed to grab and hold, though that was impossible. I remember the feeling of being hunted the way prey animals are hunted, with a predatory focus that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with sport. We made it to the truck. Somehow, despite everything, we made it. Hudson had the keys. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't get the ignition to turn, so I took them and drove. I don't remember the drive to the ranger station. I remember the headlights cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than it should be. I remember the radio crackling with Rachel asking for an update, and I remember my own voice sounding strange, higher than normal, telling her we were headed back. The station itself should have been safe. Our ranger station was a solid building, built in the 1980s with reinforced walls and good locks. We had supplies, communication equipment, a generator. Once we were inside, I told myself, things would make sense again. Whatever was out there in the dark couldn't follow us into the light. I was wrong about that. Hudson and I didn't talk about what we'd seen. Not right away. He went to the small bathroom and I heard the shower running, water pounding, him making sounds like he might be sick. I made coffee. Civilian coffee, not the ranger station swill. I updated the incident report with what I could justify. Unusual animal tracks, signs of predation, hikers experiencing fear-based reactions. I didn't mention the symbol on the rock. I didn't mention the sounds, or the way the shadows had seemed to move with intention. By 9 p.m., Hudson had changed into clean clothes and looked marginally more human. His scratches had started to scab. He sat in the small office area, hands around a mug of coffee he wasn't drinking, staring at nothing in particular. "That wasn't a bear," he finally said. "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. It wasn't any animal that should be here. Any animal that could be here. No. What are we going to do?" The honest answer was, I had no idea. Call someone, presumably. Wildlife department, game enforcement, police. But, and say what? That we'd seen tracks that maybe didn't make sense? That we'd heard sounds that could be attributed to wind and fear and darkness? That there was a symbol carved on a rock that might have been there for 50 years? Hudson was shaking his head like he was following my thoughts. "They'll call someone in to investigate," he said. "That means scientists, specialists, people with authority over this forest. And they'll find something. Whatever did this, they'll find evidence. And then what? You think it's going to just let them? You think it's going to tolerate that kind of intrusion? What choice do we have?" I asked. Hudson didn't answer. He was looking out the window into the dark. The ranger station has those big window walls, designed for lookout purposes. You can see a lot from inside. You can be seen from outside too, if there's something outside looking in. "Did you see it?" he asked. "In the trees, when we were running. Did you see what we were running from?" "No," I said, and I was grateful for that fact. There are some things that are almost better not knowing what they look like. The fear is sometimes cleaner than the reality. "I saw it," Hudson said quietly. "Just for a second, when I looked back. It was standing on something. A boulder maybe, or a fallen log. It was standing upright, but the shape was wrong. The proportions were all stretched, like something was trying to copy the shape of a man but didn't have the exact template. And the face—" "Don't," I said. "Don't describe it to me." The face had too many teeth. They were just there, visible even in the darkness. This horrible rictus grin, and the lights went out. Not flickered. Out. All of them, sudden and complete, leaving us in an absolute darkness that seemed to have weight to it. "The generator," I said, standing up so fast my chair fell backward. "The generator probably kicked on. The emergency lights should have come on. They're battery-backed LED units mounted on the walls. They would provide ambient illumination even if everything else failed. They didn't come on." "The windows," Hudson said. His voice was very small. "Turn your flashlight to the windows." I pulled out my phone, activated the flashlight, and aimed it toward the big window wall. There were shapes out there, pressed against the glass. More than one shape. Silhouettes in the darkness that were too large and shaped wrongly. They weren't moving. They were just there, waiting. And I could see the marks they left on the glass. Scratches and smears and patterns that suggested they'd been there for a while. Pressing, testing, looking for the give in the frame. "We call 911, Hudson said. "We call now and we tell them that there's something wrong and we need police and helicopters," and he stopped because something had started making sounds against the building. Not howling, not any animal noise that I'd ever heard. This was a kind of clicking, mechanical and wrong, coming from somewhere beneath the station's foundation. It sounded like something trying to dig, something with multiple appendages scraping at concrete and earth, methodically, with terrible patience. The scratching at the windows grew more insistent. I called 911. The dispatcher who answered wasn't Rachel. Her voice was calm, professional. She took down my location, asked about the nature of the emergency, listened while I tried to explain that there was something outside. Something large and dangerous, and we needed immediate police response. "Is the threat currently accessing the building?" she asked. "Not yet, but the generator's down and we have visual of something at the windows and there's sounds under the building." "Sounds of what nature?" I wanted to scream. Instead I said, "Digging. Something digging." "Understood. I'm dispatching police and animal control to your location. ETA 15 minutes. Can you secure the building?" "We're rangers," I said. "We have firearms." "Are the creatures currently in the building?" "Creatures?" I said. "There's more than one?" And that's when the noises stopped. All at once, like someone had turned off a switch. The clicking underneath the foundation went silent. The scratching at the windows ended. The shapes that had been pressed against the glass vanished back into darkness. 15 seconds of silence. Then the smell hit us. That same smell from the morning. That charnel house reek of spoiling meat and wild musk and ammonia, and we both knew it had gotten inside. I never saw it, not clearly. What I remember of the next 30 minutes is fragmentary, shock-distorted, the memory of a mind that was trying to process something too far outside the realm of experience. I remember Hudson screaming. Not words, just sound. A primal thing that came from his chest and lasted for 3 seconds too long. I remember running. The ranger station's hallway somehow longer than it should have been, doors appearing and disappearing. I remember Hudson's hands on my shoulders, pushing me toward the back exit. Then his hands were gone. I remember the door opening and cold air hitting my face and the smell getting worse, not better, because it was closer now and I was running into the dark. The forest at night isn't like the forest in daytime. It's not the same place. The trees are taller when you can't see where they end. The shadows are deeper, more substantial. The darkness moves like it has agency. I ran for what felt like hours but was probably minutes. I didn't have a flashlight anymore. I didn't have my radio. I had only the desperate animal knowledge that I needed to put distance between myself and the thing that had come into the ranger station. Behind me, the station was catching fire. I could see the glow after I'd gone maybe a quarter mile, visible through the trees. The building was burning from the inside, flames visible through the windows, already climbing high enough to catch the roof. I told myself it was an accident, a fault in the wiring that had been waiting for an excuse. I told myself a lot of things. By the time I heard sirens, probably 20 minutes later, though time was unreliable, the fire was so hot I could feel the warmth from where I was hiding, pressed into the base of a massive oak tree that had stood for probably 200 years. Police cars came, fire trucks came. They put out the building with surprising efficiency, and they found Hudson. He was in the common room, or what used to be the common room. The fire hadn't touched him except for the burns on his hands where he'd apparently tried to shield his face. He'd been dead for at least half an hour when they found him. Cause of death was initially listed as smoke inhalation, though the investigators seemed uncertain. There were scratches on his body, the kind that might have come from nails or branches during the fire, or the kind that might have come from something else. I didn't come out of the forest until dawn. A search and rescue volunteer found me, half delirious and suffering from hypothermia. I told them I'd run when the smell of the fire had startled me. I told them I'd been lost in the dark. I told them I couldn't remember exactly what had happened in the station before everything went wrong. I didn't tell them about the tracks that changed. I didn't tell them about the symbol on the rock. I didn't tell them about the sounds, or the shapes at the windows, or the thing that had gotten inside despite all the doors being locked. I resigned from the Ranger Service 2 weeks later. Officially, I cited stress and the tragedy involving Hudson. Unofficially, I had started hearing that sound again, the wheeze wail of something large breathing in the darkness. Only now I was hearing it even during the day, even in the city where I'd moved to try to forget those mountains. The investigation into the fire was inconclusive. Faulty wiring, they decided. Tragic accident. The rangers who came after me found nothing unusual on the Black Rock Trail. No symbol carved into rock. No tracks that didn't make sense. The forest had taken back its secrets, or it had never shown them to anyone else. 6 months ago, I got a call from Rachel, the dispatcher. "I thought you should know," she said. "We found Hudson's truck about 200 miles from here. It was in a ravine near the Virginia border. No sign of Hudson, but they found his logbook. The last entry is in his handwriting. He wrote, 'It isn't finished with us. It just wanted the station. It just wanted to burn the place where humans watch. But now it knows. Now it knows that we mark this as our territory, and it will come back to mark it differently.'" I asked her if the police had investigated. "They think he wrote it before he died," she said. "They think maybe he was in the truck when the fire started and he panicked, drove off the mountain." "Do you believe that?" I asked. There was a long pause. "No," she finally said, "but I prefer to." I hung up after that, and I've tried not to think about the mountains since. But I think about Hudson. I think about his last moments, what he saw in that darkness. I think about the thing that was wearing that terrible rictus grin, the thing with too many teeth and proportions that had never been copied from any natural template. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves through the trees outside my city apartment, I hear that sound again, the wheeze wail, the breathing of something vast. It's getting closer. I think it's hungry, and I think on some level it's still hunting. I've never been able to explain what draws a man back to a place where something tried to kill him. Maybe it's the need for closure. Maybe it's the certainty that no one will ever believe you without proof. Or maybe, and I suspect this is the real answer, it's because some doors once opened in your mind never quite close again. The recording started at midnight. I was 6 miles into the Daniel Boone National Forest, deeper than I should have been, far enough from the ranger station that my radio couldn't reach. The October air had teeth. My breath came out in clouds that hung in the beam of my flashlight like something solid, something trapped. I'd set up the audio equipment on the ridge above Raven Hollow, 3 separate recorders positioned in a triangle, each one capturing frequencies the human ear shouldn't be able to detect. Not that I expected to find anything. Not really. The first sound came through the headphones at 12:47 a.m. It wasn't a roar. That's what most people get wrong about the old stories. They imagine lions, bears, something with a voice that belongs to an animal. This was different. This was the sound of a throat, a human throat, pulled from an experience it was never meant to endure. It was simultaneously a shriek, a laugh, and the hollow rattle of wind through a corpse. My hands went numb on the equipment. I shouldn't have been alone. That was the mistake. Marcus Holloway, my former colleague from the wildlife station, had backed out 3 days before the expedition. He'd cited equipment failure and scheduling conflicts. But the truth was darker. Marcus had seen something on our last survey of the gorge, something that made him pale when I mentioned the trip. He'd pulled me aside at the ranger station and told me to abandon this project. I'd laughed it off, alone on that ridge, with November's darkness pressing in like a living thing. I wasn't laughing. The second sound came 30 seconds later. This time I almost shut down the equipment, almost packed it all up and hiked back to the truck through black forest. Consequences be damned. But I didn't. Some part of me, the part that had spent 15 years tracking unexplained phenomena in these mountains, needed to know what was making that sound. It was a voice. No question about it now. But it spoke in no language I recognized. Syllables stretched and distorted as if whatever was producing them had forgotten how human vocal cords were supposed to work. The words repeated 3 times. Ah-goo, 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 ah-goo. Then, through the static, I heard something else. The sound of something moving through the underbrush. Something large. Something that didn't bother moving quietly. I shut everything down in under 2 minutes. 20 years of field work teaches you when to follow protocol and when to follow your survival instincts. I folded up the equipment, stuffed it in my pack, and started hiking downslope. The forest was old growth here, hemlocks and oaks that had been standing since before my grandfather was born. In daylight, it's beautiful. At night, with something moving through the brush behind you, it's a cathedral of nightmares. I didn't run. Running makes prey of you. I moved steadily, kept my flashlight focused on the ground, and tried to move like I belonged there. Like I was just another animal passing through. That's when I found the bones. They were scattered across a narrow ravine, white and yellowed in my flashlight beam. My stomach clenched. I recognized some of them immediately. A femur, intact. A series of ribs, still partially connected by something that looked like dry tendon. What I didn't recognize was the pattern. The bones weren't old. Not decades old, the way bones should be if they'd been lying here for more than a season. The marrow still stained some of them with moisture. And they were arranged. No, arranged is wrong. They were stacked, deliberately placed in a pattern that made no natural sense. Jesus, I whispered, and immediately regretted making any sound at all. The flashlight beam caught something else. Scraps of fabric. Military surplus. Khaki and green. I knew that pattern. I'd seen it before. On a man named Edwin Graves who'd gone hiking 3 months ago and never came back. Edwin had been 46, a retired coal engineer from Virginia who'd taken to the mountains with an enthusiasm that should have warned me he didn't have enough experience for solo exploration. Found you, Edwin, I said quietly. That's when I heard the sound again. Not through the recorders this time. Directly above me, from the ridge I'd just ascended. The shriek that tore through the October night wasn't entirely animal. It wasn't entirely human. It was something that lived in the space between, something that had forgotten which side of that line it belonged to. It carried across the hollow with terrible clarity, the acoustic properties of the mountains amplifying it until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. And underneath it, something else, a wet, labored breathing. the sound of a creature working lungs that were too large for the body that carried them. I abandoned careful movement and ran. I should have run toward my truck. Instead, I ran deeper into the forest. That's what fear does sometimes. It shortcuts the rational brain and lets the ancient parts take over. The parts that know only flight and survival and the mindless need to get away. The forest became a blur. Branches tore at my jacket. My pack caught on roots and nearly dragged me down twice. Behind me, the thing was no longer trying to hide. It crashed through the underbrush like an avalanche, like a falling tree, like something that had outgrown the need for stealth. I burst through a dense thicket and found myself on a ridge trail I recognized. The old Cutter's Path. I'd hiked this before. Marcus and I had covered it last spring during a survey of the goat population. It ran north-south along a particularly treacherous ridge, following the old logging roads that had carved the mountains apart 100 years ago. The thing behind me had to slow down to navigate the thicket. I used those precious seconds to gain distance. My legs burned. The altitude was starting to get to me. Even 15 years of mountain work doesn't make running uphill easy. Then I saw it. The clearing opened up on my right, and in the weak moonlight that filtered through the trees, I saw the silhouette. My mind tried to process what I was looking at. My brain rejected the image and asked me to look again. It was roughly humanoid. That was the most horrifying part. The thing standing not 50 feet away on the ridge had a frame that could almost be mistaken for a man. If that man had been stretched on a medieval rack, his joints pulled apart and reassembled at angles that evolution never intended. Its head was too narrow, its shoulders were too broad, and from its chest, something like antlers curved upward. No, not antlers, bone spikes, like a demented crown of calcified malice. The smell hit me a moment later. Rotten meat and copper and something underneath it all, something ancient and wrong. I've smelled death in the mountains before. Bears, deer, hikers who didn't make it out. This was death with something added. Something that had been dead for 1,000 years and somehow kept moving anyway. The thing's head tilted toward me. I couldn't see its eyes in the darkness, but I felt them. "No," it said. The word came out layered, as if 3 voices were speaking it at different speeds. "No, no, no, no. Mine. Here. Mine." I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled my knife, a folding blade with an 8-inch fixed edge, and I jumped. The ridge dropped away on both sides into nothing. The darkness below suggested a fall of maybe 200 feet, maybe more. I didn't think about impact velocity. I didn't think about broken bones or unconsciousness or the long hours of slowly bleeding out on a forest floor that no one would find. I jumped, and I fell. The fall lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt like 3 minutes. I hit a slope at an angle that probably would have killed me if I'd hit it straight on. Instead, I rolled with the impact, my pack absorbing some of the impact, my body taking most of it. I slammed against a tree trunk and felt a rib shift with a sick, popping sensation. The pain was immediate and white-hot. I lay there in the darkness, breathing in shallow gasps, and waited for the thing to follow me down. It didn't. I could hear it above on the ridge, moving back and forth, that horrible breathing growing louder and more agitated. It let out another shriek, that terrible layered sound, and I realized what I was hearing. Hunger. Not the simple hunger of an animal that needed food to survive. Something older, something fundamental. The thing above me was experiencing hunger the way a black hole experiences gravity. As the core of its existence, the only thing it knew. I picked myself up and kept moving. The rib hurt like hell with each step, but adrenaline can carry you a long way. I stumbled down the slope, away from the ridge, toward lower ground where maybe my chances improved. That's when I saw the cave. It was just an opening in the rock face, barely visible in the moonlight that filtered through the trees, a scar in the mountain. I should have ignored it. Every instinct I'd spent years refining told me that caves in these mountains harbored things I didn't want to meet in confined spaces. But the thing on the ridge was moving again. I heard it crashing down the slope after me, less carefully now, more desperate. I could feel its hunger like a physical pressure. I took the cave. The opening was tight, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. I forced myself into the darkness, my flashlight beam cutting a tunnel of visibility into what felt like the mountain's own throat. The cave descended, angling downward at a steep pitch. I followed it, deeper, until the opening behind me was just a distant gleam of moonlight. That's when I found the pile. My flashlight beam caught bone again, but this time it wasn't scattered. This was an accumulation. Hundreds of bones, maybe thousands, piled in the center of the cave chamber like the remains of a slaughterhouse. Skulls, femurs, vertebrae. Mixed in with the bones were scraps of clothing, fragments of backpacks, and things that might have been camping equipment or might have been too degraded to identify. In the center of the pile, something glinted. I picked my way forward carefully and found a leather journal, its pages swollen with moisture and age. The cover was dated 1982. I opened it, and the handwriting inside was shaky, urgent, written in the dark by someone fighting panic. It took Tommy. I saw it take him. It was running on its hind legs, faster than anything that big should be able to move. It dragged him back toward the dark place. I heard him screaming until the entry ended there, the pen trailing off the page in a line that suggested the writer's hand had stopped moving. The next entry was dated 3 days later. I'm infected, I can feel it happening. The changes started this morning. The thing got me, just scratched my shoulder, nothing serious or so I thought. But the fever came and now my fingers are too long and my teeth are starting to ache. I understand now. I understand what it is. It spreads, not like a disease, like a hunger. It made me hungry too. I went back out and The entry stopped. The remaining pages were blank except for one, dated almost a month later, written in a completely different hand. I found him in here, what he'd become. Still had the journal. Still had enough of him left to want to record the truth. I'm going to burn this place, burn the whole hollow if I have to. It ends with me. The handwriting was Marcus Holloway's. I was still staring at the journal when I heard the breathing behind me. You found my collection, the thing said. I spun around. The creature was crouched in the cave mouth, its outline visible against the faint light from outside. This close, I could see details I'd missed before. The skin, where there was skin, was mottled, gray and yellow in patches. Where it wasn't skin, bone showed through, as if the thing had simply run out of flesh and decided to continue anyway. The antler crown was made of human bone. I recognized a femur in there, a clavicle. Marcus? I heard myself say the name like a question, like I was hoping for a negative answer. The thing that had been Marcus Holloway laughed. That sound I'd heard on the recordings. That terrible layered sound. Marcus is gone, it said. I'm what comes after Marcus, the logical conclusion. The thing Marcus became when he understood the truth about the hunger. You're going to understand too. That's why I let you jump. Why I followed at a distance. You're special, you see. You came looking for the truth. You're not some terrified hiker who wandered into the wrong place. You came here deliberately. You recorded my voice. You wanted to find me. The fever started about 6 hours after the scratches appeared. It wasn't the kind of fever you get from a normal infection. This was something that felt like my blood itself was being rewritten. I found a cave branch that ran deeper into the mountain, away from Marcus's domain, and I tried to hide there, as if hiding could stop what was happening. My fingers started to elongate around hour 8. The pain was excruciating. It felt like my bones were being pulled through my skin, stretching and reshaping themselves into something that wasn't quite human anymore. I watched in the light of my flashlight as my nails hardened and sharpened into something that looked disturbingly like claws. The hunger came around hour 12. It was nothing like normal hunger. It wasn't the feeling of a stomach that needed food. This was existential. This was a void that yawned open inside me, a need so fundamental that ignoring it felt like ignoring the need to breathe. Except the thing I needed to breathe was understanding, knowledge, flesh. I understood what Marcus had written in that journal. The infection wasn't a disease. It was something older. Something that lived in the Appalachian Mountains deeper than caves, written into the stone and the soil. The Wendigo, or whatever name people gave it, wasn't something that hunted and killed. It was something that hunted and changed, that converted. By hour 18, I couldn't fit through the cave opening anymore. My shoulders had widened, the bone lengthening and strengthening. My skin felt tight, like it was shrinking even as the muscle underneath grew larger. I looked down at my hands. They weren't hands anymore. They were something else. That's when I understood why Marcus had tried to burn it all down. Why he'd written about ending it. Because the thing you become when the Wendigo takes you isn't a monster that needs to be studied or captured or understood. It's an echo, A copy, a version of you that only remembers hunger. I found a chamber deeper in the caves, one that Marcus hadn't marked in his journal. And I did what I had to do. The recordings never made it out of the mountains. Equipment failure, the official report said, happens all the time in remote areas. Electrical surge, possible water damage, complete corruption of the data files. The ranger station accepted it as one of those things. Bad luck, the mountain being difficult. What they didn't know was that I'd destroyed the equipment deliberately. I'd smashed the recorders with rocks and scattered the pieces across the ravine where I'd found Edwin's bones. I'd burned my pack, my notes, everything that documented what I'd found, because I understood something in those caves that Marcus hadn't quite grasped when he was writing in the journal. The thing in the mountain doesn't want to be found. Not because it hides, because anyone who finds it becomes part of it. And part of it wants to spread. Part of it wants to convert more people, create more versions of itself, build more echoes in the darkness of the earth. I also understood why I was still myself. The infection should have taken me by day 3. The complete transformation should have happened by day 5. My fingers should have continued lengthening. My bones should have continued reshaping. But somewhere around hour 36, as I was crouching in a chamber so deep that the darkness was absolute, something shifted. I made a choice. Maybe it was because I came to the mountains looking for the truth rather than stumbling into it. Maybe it was because I'd already known part of the story, Marcus's warnings, his fear. Maybe I was just stubborn. But I took the hunting knife, the one I'd drawn on the ridge, and I cut. I don't know how to describe what I removed. Some part of the infection that had settled in my chest, a weight that felt almost like a second heart. It came out as something between flesh and shadow, and when it did, the transformation stopped. The healing took weeks. I hiked out of the mountains slowly, following old trails I knew, avoiding ranger stations and civilization. I told people I'd gotten injured, that I'd gotten lost, that equipment failure had prevented me from completing my study. All of it was technically true. The scratches on my shoulder healed clean, no scar tissue, no evidence that anything unusual had happened. My fingers returned to normal. My body went back to being human in every measurable way. But I remember the hunger. I remember the clarity that came with it, the absolute understanding of what I was meant to become. And every October, as the weather starts to turn and the nights grow long, I feel it whispering at the edge of my consciousness, a half-formed hunger, a potential. I haven't been back to the Appalachian Mountains since that night. I've been offered assignments there 3 times. Twice I turned them down. The 3rd time I transferred to a different agency. I told them I'd decided to pursue other interests. They accepted it, but I still monitor the rangers' reports. I still follow the missing persons cases. Every year someone disappears in those mountains. Some get found, some don't. And every year I look at the names and I wonder if any of them are being converted in the dark, if any of them are discovering what it means to echo instead of live. Marcus tried to burn it down. He probably would have succeeded if the infection hadn't already begun, if his body hadn't needed to hunt before he could carry through with his plan. I saved myself by letting it partially take me and then cutting it out. But I wonder sometimes if I just delayed the inevitable. If, deep in my chest where I made that cut, something is still waiting, still hungry, still whispering. The mountains are patient. The mountains have a lot of time, and I'm still breathing, which means the infection isn't finished with me yet. I've never been able to explain what draws a man back to a place where something tried to kill him. Maybe it's the need for closure. Maybe it's the certainty that no one will ever believe you without proof. Or maybe, and I suspect this is the real answer, it's because some doors once opened in your mind never quite close again. The recording started at midnight. I was 6 miles into the Daniel Boone National Forest, deeper than I should have been, far enough from the ranger station that my radio couldn't reach. The October air had teeth. My breath came out in clouds that hung in the beam of my flashlight like something solid, something trapped. I'd set up the audio equipment on the ridge above Raven Hollow, 3 separate recorders positioned in a triangle, each one capturing frequencies the human ear shouldn't be able to detect. Not that I expected to find anything. Not really. The first sound came through the headphones at 12:47 a.m. It wasn't a roar. That's what most people get wrong about the old stories. They imagine lions, bears, something with a voice that belongs to an animal. This was different. This was the sound of a throat, a human throat, pulled from an experience it was never meant to endure. It was simultaneously a shriek, a laugh, and the hollow rattle of wind through a corpse. My hands went numb on the equipment. I shouldn't have been alone. That was the mistake. Marcus Holloway, my former colleague from the wildlife station, had backed out 3 days before the expedition. He'd cited equipment failure and scheduling conflicts. But the truth was darker. Marcus had seen something on our last survey of the gorge, something that made him pale when I mentioned the trip. He'd pulled me aside at the ranger station and told me to abandon this project. I'd laughed it off, alone on that ridge, with November's darkness pressing in like a living thing. I wasn't laughing. The second sound came 30 seconds later. This time I almost shut down the equipment, almost packed it all up and hiked back to the truck through black forest. Consequences be damned. But I didn't. Some part of me, the part that had spent 15 years tracking unexplained phenomena in these mountains, needed to know what was making that sound. It was a voice. No question about it now. But it spoke in no language I recognized. Syllables stretched and distorted as if whatever was producing them had forgotten how human vocal cords were supposed to work. The words repeated 3 times. Agoo, 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 agoo. Then, through the static, I heard something else. The sound of something moving through the underbrush. Something large. Something that didn't bother moving quietly. I shut everything down in under 2 minutes. 20 years of field work teaches you when to follow protocol and when to follow your survival instincts. I folded up the equipment, stuffed it in my pack, and started hiking downslope. The forest was old growth here, hemlocks and oaks that had been standing since before my grandfather was born. In daylight, it's beautiful. At night, with something moving through the brush behind you, it's a cathedral of nightmares. I didn't run. Running makes prey of you. I moved steadily, kept my flashlight focused on the ground, and tried to move like I belonged there. Like I was just another animal passing through. That's when I found the bones. They were scattered across a narrow ravine, white and yellowed in my flashlight beam. My stomach clenched. I recognized some of them immediately. A femur, intact. A series of ribs, still partially connected by something that looked like dry tendon. What I didn't recognize was the pattern. The bones weren't old, not decades old, the way bones should be if they'd been lying here for more than a season. The marrow still stained some of them with moisture. And they were arranged. No, arranged is wrong. They were stacked, deliberately placed in a pattern that made no natural sense. Jesus, I whispered, and immediately regretted making any sound at all. The flashlight beam caught something else. Scraps of fabric. Military surplus. Khaki and green. I knew that pattern. I'd seen it before, on a man named Edwin Graves who'd gone hiking 3 months ago and never came back. Edwin had been 46, a retired coal engineer from Virginia who'd taken to the mountains with an enthusiasm that should have warned me he didn't have enough experience for solo exploration. Found you, Edwin, I said quietly. That's when I heard the sound again. Not through the recorders this time. Directly above me, from the ridge I'd just ascended. The shriek that tore through the October night wasn't entirely animal. It wasn't entirely human. It was something that lived in the space between. Something that had forgotten which side of that line it belonged to. It carried across the hollow with terrible clarity, the acoustic properties of the mountains amplifying it until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. And underneath it, something else. A wet, labored breathing. The sound of a creature working lungs that were too large for the body that carried them. I abandoned careful movement and ran. I should have run toward my truck. Instead, I ran deeper into the forest. That's what fear does sometimes. It shortcuts the rational brain and lets the ancient parts take over. The parts that know only flight and survival and the mindless need to get away. The forest became a blur. Branches tore at my jacket. My pack caught on roots and nearly dragged me down twice. Behind me, the thing was no longer trying to hide. It crashed through the underbrush like an avalanche, like a falling tree, like something that had outgrown the need for stealth. I burst through a dense thicket and found myself on a ridge trail I recognized. The old Cutter's Path. I'd hiked this before. Marcus and I had covered it last spring during a survey of the goat population. It ran north-south along a particularly treacherous ridge, following the old logging roads that had carved the mountains apart 100 years ago. The thing behind me had to slow down to navigate the thicket. I used those precious seconds to gain distance. My legs burned. The altitude was starting to get to me. Even 15 years of mountain work doesn't make running uphill easy. Then I saw it. The clearing opened up on my right, and in the weak moonlight that filtered through the trees, I saw the silhouette. My mind tried to process what I was looking at. My brain rejected the image and asked me to look again. It was roughly humanoid. That was the most horrifying part. The thing standing not 50 feet away on the ridge had a frame that could almost be mistaken for a man. If that man had been stretched on a medieval rack, his joints pulled apart and reassembled at angles that evolution never intended. Its head was too narrow, its shoulders were too broad, and from its chest, something like antlers curved upward. No, not antlers, bone spikes, like a demented crown of calcified malice. The smell hit me a moment later. Rotten meat and copper and something underneath it all, something ancient and wrong. I've smelled death in the mountains before. Bears, deer, hikers who didn't make it out. This was death with something added, something that had been dead for 1,000 years and somehow kept moving anyway. The thing's head tilted toward me. I couldn't see its eyes in the darkness, but I felt them. No, it said. The word came out layered, as if 3 voices were speaking it at different speeds. No, 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 no. Mine, here, mine. I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled my knife, a folding blade with an 8-inch fixed edge, and I jumped. The ridge dropped away on both sides into nothing. The darkness below suggested a fall of maybe 200 feet, maybe more. I didn't think about impact velocity. I didn't think about broken bones or unconsciousness or the long hours of slowly bleeding out on a forest floor that no one would find. I jumped, and I fell. The fall lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt like 3 minutes. I hit a slope at an angle that probably would have killed me if I'd hit it straight on. Instead, I rolled with the impact, my pack absorbing some of the impact, my body taking most of it. I slammed against a tree trunk and felt a rib shift with a sick, popping sensation. The pain was immediate and white-hot. I lay there in the darkness, breathing in shallow gasps, and waited for the thing to follow me down. It didn't. I could hear it above on the ridge, moving back and forth, that horrible breathing growing louder and more agitated. It let out another shriek, that terrible layered sound, and I realized what I was hearing. Hunger. Not the simple hunger of an animal that needed food to survive. Something older, something fundamental. The thing above me was experiencing hunger the way a black hole experiences gravity. As the core of its existence, the only thing it knew. I picked myself up and kept moving. The rib hurt like hell with each step, but adrenaline can carry you a long way. I stumbled down the slope, away from the ridge, toward lower ground where maybe my chances improved. That's when I saw the cave. It was just an opening in the rock face, barely visible in the moonlight that filtered through the trees, a scar in the mountain. I should have ignored it. Every instinct I'd spent years refining told me that caves in these mountains harbored things I didn't want to meet in confined spaces. But the thing on the ridge was moving again. I heard it crashing down the slope after me, less carefully now, more desperate. I could feel its hunger like a physical pressure. I took the cave. The opening was tight, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. I forced myself into the darkness, my flashlight beam cutting a tunnel of visibility into what felt like the mountain's own throat. The cave descended, angling downward at a steep pitch. I followed it, deeper, until the opening behind me was just a distant gleam of moonlight. That's when I found the pile. My flashlight beam caught bone again, but this time it wasn't scattered. This was an accumulation. Hundreds of bones, maybe thousands, piled in the center of the cave chamber like the remains of a slaughterhouse. Skulls, femurs, vertebrae. Mixed in with the bones were scraps of clothing, fragments of backpacks, and things that might have been camping equipment or might have been too degraded to identify. In the center of the pile, something glinted. I picked my way forward carefully and found a leather journal, its pages swollen with moisture and age. The cover was dated 1982. I opened it, and the handwriting inside was shaky, urgent, written in the dark by someone fighting panic. It took Tommy. I saw it take him. It was running on its hind legs, faster than anything that big should be able to move. It dragged him back toward the dark place. I heard him screaming, until the entry ended there, the pen trailing off the page in a line that suggested the writer's hand had stopped moving. The next entry was dated 3 days later. I'm infected, I can feel it happening. The changes started this morning. The thing got me, just scratched my shoulder, nothing serious, or so I thought. But the fever came, and now my fingers are too long and my teeth are starting to ache. I understand now. I understand what it is. It spreads, not like a disease, like a hunger. It made me hungry too. I went back out and The entry stopped. The remaining pages were blank except for one, dated almost a month later, written in a completely different hand. I found him in here, what he'd become. Still had the journal. Still had enough of him left to want to record the truth. I'm going to burn this place, burn the whole hollow if I have to. It ends with me. The handwriting was Marcus Holloway's. I was still staring at the journal when I heard the breathing behind me. "You found my collection," the thing said. I spun around. The creature was crouched in the cave mouth, its outline visible against the faint light from outside. This close, I could see details I'd missed before. The skin, where there was skin, was mottled, gray and yellow in patches. Where it wasn't skin, bone showed through, as if the thing had simply run out of flesh and decided to continue anyway. The antler crown was made of human bone. I recognized a femur in there, a clavicle. "Marcus?" I heard myself say the name like a question, like I was hoping for a negative answer. The thing that had been Marcus Holloway laughed. That sound I'd heard on the recordings. That terrible layered sound. "Marcus is gone," it said. "I'm what comes after Marcus, the logical conclusion. The thing Marcus became when he understood the truth about the hunger. You're going to understand too. That's why I let you jump. Why I followed at a distance. You're special, you see. You came looking for the truth. You're not some terrified hiker who wandered into the wrong place. You came here deliberately. You recorded my voice. You wanted to find me." The fever started about 6 hours after the scratches appeared. It wasn't the kind of fever you get from a normal infection. This was something that felt like my blood itself was being rewritten. I found a cave branch that ran deeper into the mountain, away from Marcus's domain, and I tried to hide there, as if hiding could stop what was happening. My fingers started to elongate around hour 8. The pain was excruciating. It felt like my bones were being pulled through my skin, stretching and reshaping themselves into something that wasn't quite human anymore. I watched in the light of my flashlight as my nails hardened and sharpened into something that looked disturbingly like claws. The hunger came around hour 12. It was nothing like normal hunger. It wasn't the feeling of a stomach that needed food. This was existential. This was a void that yawned open inside me, a need so fundamental that ignoring it felt like ignoring the need to breathe. Except the thing I needed to breathe was understanding, knowledge, flesh. I understood what Marcus had written in that journal. The infection wasn't a disease. It was something older. Something that lived in the Appalachian Mountains deeper than caves, written into the stone and the soil. The Wendigo, or whatever name people gave it, wasn't something that hunted and killed. It was something that hunted and changed, that converted. By hour 18, I couldn't fit through the cave opening anymore. My shoulders had widened, the bone lengthening and strengthening. My skin felt tight, like it was shrinking even as the muscle underneath grew larger. I looked down at my hands. They weren't hands anymore. They were something else. That's when I understood why Marcus had tried to burn it all down. Why he'd written about ending it. Because the thing you become when the Wendigo takes you isn't a monster that needs to be studied or captured or understood. It's an echo, a copy, a version of you that only remembers hunger. I found a chamber deeper in the caves, one that Marcus hadn't marked in his journal. And I did what I had to do. The recordings never made it out of the mountains. Equipment failure, the official report said, happens all the time in remote areas. Electrical surge, possible water damage, complete corruption of the data files. The ranger station accepted it as one of those things. Bad luck, the mountain being difficult. What they didn't know was that I'd destroyed the equipment deliberately. I'd smashed the recorders with rocks and scattered the pieces across the ravine where I'd found Edwin's bones. I'd burned my pack, my notes, everything that documented what I'd found. Because I understood something in those caves that Marcus hadn't quite grasped when he was writing in the journal. The thing in the mountain doesn't want to be found. Not because it hides, because anyone who finds it becomes part of it. And part of it wants to spread. Part of it wants to convert more people, create more versions of itself, build more echoes in the darkness of the earth. I also understood why I was still myself. The infection should have taken me by day 3. The complete transformation should have happened by day 5. My fingers should have continued lengthening. My bones should have continued reshaping. But somewhere around hour 36, as I was crouching in a chamber so deep that the darkness was absolute, something shifted. I made a choice. Maybe it was because I came to the mountains looking for the truth rather than stumbling into it. Maybe it was because I'd already known part of the story. Marcus's warnings, his fear. Maybe I was just stubborn. But I took the hunting knife, the one I'd drawn on the ridge, and I cut. I don't know how to describe what I removed. Some part of the infection that had settled in my chest, a weight that felt almost like a second heart. It came out as something between flesh and shadow, and when it did, the transformation stopped. The healing took weeks. I hiked out of the mountains slowly, following old trails I knew, avoiding ranger stations and civilization. I told people I'd gotten injured, that I'd gotten lost, that equipment failure had prevented me from completing my study. All of it was technically true. The scratches on my shoulder healed clean, no scar tissue, no evidence that anything unusual had happened. My fingers returned to normal. My body went back to being human in every measurable way. But I remember the hunger. I remember the clarity that came with it, the absolute understanding of what I was meant to become. And every October, as the weather starts to turn and the nights grow long, I feel it whispering at the edge of my consciousness, a half-formed hunger, a potential. I haven't been back to the Appalachian Mountains since that night. I've been offered assignments there 3 times. Twice I turned them down. The third time I transferred to a different agency. I told them I'd decided to pursue other interests. They accepted it, but I still monitor the rangers' reports. I still follow the missing persons cases. Every year someone disappears in those mountains. Some get found, some don't. And every year I look at the names and I wonder if any of them are being converted in the dark, if any of them are discovering what it means to echo instead of live. Marcus tried to burn it down. He probably would have succeeded if the infection hadn't already begun, if his body hadn't needed to hunt before he could carry through with his plan. I saved myself by letting it partially take me and then cutting it out. But I wonder sometimes if I just delayed the inevitable. If, deep in my chest where I made that cut, something is still waiting, still hungry, still whispering. The mountains are patient. The mountains have a lot of time, and I'm still breathing, which means the infection isn't finished with me yet.